In the stillness before memory, when mountains were young and the sky burned with the breath of gods, the world of men was not yet alone. The heavens shimmered with divine footsteps, and rivers whispered the names of immortals. It was an age when Olympus watched the earth not from distance, but from desire, an age where destiny slept lightly, waiting for the touch that would awaken it. Across the plain of Troy, the dawn was a song of gold. The Dardanian hills blushed beneath morning's first flame, and in that tender silence the kingdom of Priam stood proud and serene. Its towers, born of stone and sunlight, seemed untouched by time, as though even ruin itself dared not trespass there. Yet even in beauty, the gods plant the seeds of sorrow, and beneath the calm, the loom of fate began to stir. Far from the mortal world, on Olympus crowned in mist, the gods gathered in splendor. Zeus, father of thunder, ruled from his throne of storm and marble. Beside him, Hera watched with eyes that saw the hearts of kings. Athena, bright in wisdom's armor, stood unmoved, while Aphrodite, soft and radiant, smiled with the ease of one who knew that beauty could conquer empires. Around them, immortality hummed, a stillness too vast for mortal breath. But in the midst of their harmony, a shadow approached, a discordant note in a celestial song. Eris, goddess of strife, unbidden and unwelcome, crossed the threshold of light. In her hand she bore a gift, a single apple of gold, upon which was inscribed 3 fateful words to the fairest. The air trembled. The gods fell silent. In that quiet moment, eternity shifted. The apple passed from hand to hand, gleaming like temptation itself. Hera's gaze hardened with pride. Athena's eyes narrowed with judgment. Aphrodite's smile deepened into something dangerous. What began as a jest soon burned into rivalry, and the heavens, once calm, felt the pulse of vanity awaken. Zeus, wise enough to fear the quarrel of goddesses, cast the burden elsewhere. Let the matter, he decreed, be judged by a mortal one untouched by Olympus, yet favored by fate. And so the threads of destiny descended to the world of men, seeking the one whose choice would alter history. Far below the clouds, upon the slopes of Mount Ida, a young shepherd dreamed beneath the boughs. His name was Paris, son of Priam, though he did not yet know the weight of his lineage. He lived simply, tending his flocks among the quiet streams and the hum of bees, unaware that the eyes of heaven watched him with intent. As the morning wind brushed the grass, the sound of wings stirred the air. 3 goddesses descended, robed in splendor that dimmed the sun. They came not as symbols, but as forces of the world itself, power, wisdom, and desire. And they placed before Paris the golden apple that had set the heavens aflame. The shepherd rose in silence, the weight of divinity pressing against his mortal breath. Before him stood the daughters of heaven, Hera, queen of gods, her presence commanding as a storm restrained. Athena, calm and austere, her gaze the edge of thought itself. And Aphrodite, whose beauty softened the very air, turning the hillside into a dream of light. Each spoke, and in their words, the fate of nations gathered like thunder beyond the horizon. Hera's voice was deep, regal, steady. The sound of crown and kingdom intertwined. "Choose me, Paris," she said, her eyes reflecting the glow of Olympus, "and I shall make you lord of all men. Power beyond the grasp of kings shall be yours. Empires will bow, and your name shall live in the fear of others." Then came Athena, her tone clear as a blade drawn in moonlight. "Choose me, and I shall grant you wisdom," she whispered, "the strength of mind to shape your own destiny. You will know victory in all things, war, speech, and counsel alike. No man shall surpass you, for the clarity of your thought will conquer all." Last came Aphrodite, who did not speak at first. She only smiled, the kind of smile that unravels reason and softens time itself. When she did speak, her words were soft as falling petals. "Choose me, Paris," she breathed, "and I will give you the greatest gift a mortal may ever hold, the love of the world's most beautiful woman." Her voice lingered, a fragrance in the wind. Paris felt the promise coil around his heart, not in words, but in sensation. The faint echo of laughter, the shimmer of skin in candlelight, the distant sound of a name he had not yet heard, Helen. And in that fragile moment, the mortal heart triumphed over divine caution. He gave the apple to Aphrodite. The mountain grew still. The air, once golden, deepened into dusk. The choice had been made, and the heavens knew it could not be undone. Hera turned away with the coldness of iron. Athena's gaze burned with quiet wrath. Only Aphrodite's laughter, soft and lilting, drifted across the valley like the sound of water over stone. As she vanished into the ether, she left behind not peace, but promise, the kind that binds gods and men to suffering alike. Paris stood alone upon the mountain, his heart uncertain, his hand still warm from the touch of immortality. The sky above seemed vast and endless, yet heavy with unseen consequence. A soft wind moved through the grass, carrying whispers of things to come, of ships gathering, of walls burning, of names carved into song and sorrow. And though he did not yet know it, the choice of a single shepherd had set the stars themselves into motion. As dawn returned to the slopes of Ida, Paris descended from the mountain, his heart restless beneath the weight of invisible chains. Around him, the pastures stretched in golden quiet, the same sheep grazing, the same river threading through reeds, yet something in the air had changed. The world itself seemed to hum with new awareness, as if the gods had woven his name into the fabric of fate. He walked slowly, unsure of what had transpired, unsure even if it had been real. The touch of divine presence still lingered in his thoughts, the brilliance of Hera's crown, the cold shimmer of Athena's eyes, the warmth of Aphrodite's smile. Each moment replayed like a dream glimpsed through mist. But beneath it all lay a whisper he could not shake, a promise unfulfilled, waiting beyond the horizon, the love of the world's most beautiful woman. Far across the sea, in the land of Sparta, that promised breath, Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, born from the shimmer of a swan's wing, lived surrounded by grace and silence. Her beauty was not the kind that shouted, but the kind that stilled all sound. Men who looked upon her forgot their purpose. Women felt the ache of her presence like the memory of something lost. She had been married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, a strong man, just and proud, and their halls glittered with the calm of power. Yet even among such wealth, Helen's eyes carried a melancholy that no gold could soothe. Aphrodite's hand, unseen but certain, had already begun to draw the threads together. Dreams brushed against dreams. Helen would wake at times with a strange unease, her mind adrift in visions of a distant shore, of a man whose face she had never seen. And Paris, beneath the shadow of Mount Ida, found his thoughts filled with the image of someone he could not name. The goddess's promise pulsed between them like a heartbeat beneath the world. Time, as it often does in the weaving of fate, moved gently forward. Priam's messengers found Paris among the hills and brought him word of his birthright, that he was no mere shepherd, but the lost prince of Troy, returned by destiny to the throne he had never known. His parents, once told by prophecy that their son would bring ruin to their house, received him with tears and trembling. Yet in the halls of Troy, joy rose like sunlight over sorrow, and for a while peace returned. The city itself seemed blessed, its towers glittered with gold, its markets swelled with life, and its walls reached proudly toward the sky. Yet within the heart of that shining city, the gods watched with quiet intent. Hera's pride still smoldered, Athena's vengeance waited like a drawn bow, and Aphrodite, triumphant, smiled upon the mortal she had chosen as her instrument. Paris stood on the walls of Troy at sunset, the Aegean glowing like molten glass beneath him. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the spark of his destiny, and the woman whose love would burn both nations and hearts alike. As the last light faded, a breeze swept through the plain, carrying with it the scent of distant seas and the murmuring of unseen tides. The days that followed were woven with celebration. In the halls of Troy, music shimmered like sunlight upon bronze, and the people rejoiced in the return of their prince. Priam, gentle and aged by the burdens of kingship, clasped his son's hands as though to anchor him to the living. Hecuba wept softly, her tears born of love and of the old fear that prophecy might still find its way to truth. Paris walked among them as one awakened from a long dream. The city, radiant and resplendent, unfolded before him, its courtyards filled with fountains that mirrored the sky, its towers gilded with the light of the setting sun. From the high ramparts, he could see the plains stretching toward the sea, endless and serene, hiding beneath their calm the paths that armies would one day tread. Each evening, the winds carried faint traces of salt, whispers of distant harbors. It was there on those twilight walls that Paris began to feel the pull, the invisible thread of Aphrodite's promise tightening around his heart. The goddess had not forgotten her gift. She moved unseen, weaving dreams through his sleep. In them he saw a woman draped in gold and light, her face both known and unknown, her eyes vast as the sea itself. When he reached for her, she always drifted beyond touch, yet the scent of her lingered long after waking. Soon an opportunity arose. A delegation from Troy was to sail to Sparta, bearing gifts and treaties to the court of Menelaus. The journey was one of diplomacy, yet to Paris it felt like destiny calling. Priam, cautious yet indulgent, granted him leave to go, unaware that the voyage would open the gates of ruin. And so, on a morning shrouded in silver mist, the Prince of Troy set sail. The Aegean unfolded beneath his ship like a mirror to the heavens, waves gliding in gentle rhythm, gulls tracing slow arcs against the dawn. Paris stood at the prow, his eyes fixed upon the horizon, where the line between sea and sky blurred into infinity. The men around him spoke of winds and stars, of trade and treaties, but Paris heard only the murmur of the sea, a voice older than memory, whispering the same word again and again, Helen. Days passed in quiet procession. Islands rose and fell against the sun. The sails swelled with divine breath, guiding them toward the fated shore. At times, the sea seemed too calm, as if the gods themselves stilled the waters to ensure his arrival. Even the stars above seemed to drift with purpose, their slow turning marking the path to Sparta. When at last they reached the harbor, the city shone before them, its marble temples gleaming, its columns rising like pale flame from the earth. Menelaus' palace overlooked it all, proud and serene. And within those gilded halls, unaware of the storm approaching, Helen awaited the guest who would unmake her world. As Paris stepped onto Spartan soil, the air grew heavy, not with dread, but with destiny. The goddess watched unseen, her smile lingering in the wind. The palace of Menelaus gleamed like a vision carved from sunlight and marble. Within its halls, laughter and the murmur of lyres drifted through open courtyards where olive trees swayed in the warmth of afternoon. It was there, among the cool shadows and perfumed air, that Paris first beheld Helen of Sparta. She moved with the calm grace of one accustomed to being observed, yet untouched by the gaze of others. Her beauty was not loud nor proud. It was something quiet, like dawn spreading across still waters. Her voice, when she spoke, seemed to soften the distance between heartbeats. To see her was to understand why poets call beauty divine, and why the gods themselves had risked war for it. Aphrodite's hand, unseen but sure, guided every glance. When Helen's eyes met Paris's, time seemed to fold in upon itself. It was as though they had known one another before in dreams, in whispers, in the spaces between lifetimes. She smiled gently as one who recognizes an echo long unheard. Menelaus received his guests with warmth, untroubled and proud. The king spoke of alliances, of the bonds that held nations in uneasy peace. Yet even as the wine was poured and the music rose, something fragile began to stir beneath the surface, an invisible tremor that neither words nor ceremony could still. Helen's laughter lingered longer that night, her eyes drawn too often toward the foreign prince whose voice carried a rhythm not of Greece but of dreams. Paris, for his part, felt as though the world had narrowed to a single point of light, her presence filling every thought, her face haunting even the silence between breaths. The goddess's promise was fulfilled not through force, but through the quiet inevitability of longing. Days became a blur of sunlit walks and soft conversations. In the gardens, beneath the rippling leaves, they spoke not of kingdoms or duty, but of stars, of the color of distant seas, of what it meant to feel alive. Each word drew them closer, not by choice, but by the current of something older than will, the tide of divine design. When Menelaus departed for Crete, leaving Helen to tend the palace in his absence, the goddess's whisper grew louder. The nights turned heavy with perfume and uncertainty. The moon, pale and vast, watched over their meetings like a silent accomplice. At last, when the world seemed to hold its breath, Paris spoke the words that would shatter the peace of two nations. He told her of his dream, of the judgment upon Mount Ida, of the goddess who had promised him her love, of the strange certainty that had led him to her. Helen listened, her heart trembling between fear and recognition. The air between them shimmered with choice. When dawn came, the harbor stirred. Ships lay ready, their sails hushed in morning light. Helen stood beside Paris at the water's edge, her face pale, her eyes wide with something deeper than sorrow, the knowing that her life, as it was, had ended. The goddess's promise had been kept, but the cost had already begun to whisper in the wind. As they stepped aboard, the sea accepted them in silence, its vastness concealing both hope and ruin. The sea stretched endless before them, a living mirror of blue and silver where sky and water met in quiet conspiracy. The ship creaked softly beneath the touch of the wind, and the oars moved in rhythm, their steady pull echoing like a heartbeat upon the waves. Behind them, Sparta faded into mist, its white columns dissolving beneath the horizon. Before them lay Troy, distant, radiant, and waiting. Helen stood at the prow, her veil stirring in the salt-laden air. She said little, yet her silence carried the weight of kingdoms. Paris, standing beside her, watched the line of her profile against the light, the soft curve of her face, the faint shimmer of gold at her wrists. Between them no words were needed. The goddess's spell bound them more deeply than mortal vows could ever reach. Yet beneath the calm, the gods stirred uneasily. Hera's anger rolled like distant thunder, her pride wounded by the shepherd's slight. Athena's wrath sharpened into purpose, cold and precise. Only Aphrodite reclined in her laughter, pleased with her craft, though even she knew that love, once loosed, could not be contained. As night descended, the sea grew darker, its voice rising in a low, eternal hum. Stars spilled across the heavens, the same stars that had watched the birth of men and the fall of empires. Paris gazed upward, wondering if the gods in their distant thrones watched still. Helen leaned close, her words soft as wind. The stars are so many, and yet they do not fall. Perhaps they envy us that we can choose to fall, even for love. Her words lingered, fragile and eternal. The waves carried them forward, each crest a quiet heartbeat in the dark. When at last the outline of Troy appeared upon the dawn horizon, it seemed less a city and more a vision. Its walls rising from the mist like the bones of the earth, its towers aflame with sunlight. Trumpets sounded from the ramparts, and the people gathered upon the shores, marveling at what they beheld. Their prince returned, bearing a queen of surpassing beauty. Priam, moved by joy, welcomed them with open arms. The city rejoiced, not yet knowing that joy had arrived wearing the mask of doom. For as the gates closed behind them, the fates wove faster. In the still air of celebration, the first tremors of tragedy took root. Helen walked through the halls of Troy as though through a dream, her feet brushing the marble floors, her gaze meeting those who stared in awe and in secret dread. Some whispered that she was a blessing, others that she was a sign. And through it all, the gods watched in silence, each preparing their part in the story that would echo through all ages. As evening fell, the torches along the walls burned like stars, and the sea sighed against the shore, as if mourning what it already knew. The spark had been lit, a single ember glowing beneath the stars. And though peace still lay upon Troy, the wind had begun to rise. As the years passed, that dream of love would awaken a nightmare of nations. Beyond the shining walls of Troy, the world still slumbered in fragile peace. Yet across the wine-dark sea, in the sunlit courts of Sparta, that peace had begun to waver. The winds carried whispers, faint, uncertain, yet touched with the rhythm of change. For love, once loosed, moves not as a gentle current, but as a tide that claims all it touches. Helen of Sparta walked among marble colonnades, her steps as soft as the drifting petals that followed her. The daughter of Zeus and Leda, her beauty seemed older than the world, a radiance born not merely of form, but of something the soul recognized and could never forget. Yet within her, stillness warred with sorrow. Menelaus, her husband, was kind, steadfast, and proud, yet his love could not quiet the restlessness that stirred behind her gaze. Each dawn she stood before the eastern balcony, watching the first light strike the hills. It was in those hours between sleep and waking that she felt most divided, torn between the comfort of what she knew and the haunting pull of something far beyond it. Often she dreamed of a face she could not name, a voice that called across the sea, tender and unrelenting. The gods, it seemed, had not forgotten her. When Paris came to Sparta, he came not as a thief, but as a guest. His arrival was heralded with ceremony, his name spoken with respect, his beauty whispered about in the shaded corridors of the palace. The Prince of Troy was unlike any who had come before him, gentle in manner, graceful in speech, and touched with the quiet gravity of one who carried divine favor. Helen saw him first in the hall of Menelaus, when the sun fell through the lattice and bathed him in gold. His presence stilled her not by force, but by recognition, as if some ancient chord within her heart had been struck once more. Paris bowed low before the Spartan king, yet his eyes found Helen, and lingered just a moment too long. That moment would live forever. As the days passed, he became a familiar presence at feasts, in gardens, along the colonnades that overlooked the sea. They spoke seldom of weighty things. Their words were of weather, of music, of the distant lands that stretched between their homes. Yet beneath each exchange, a current deepened, silent but sure, like roots growing beneath the earth. And Aphrodite, unseen but ever near, smiled upon them both. The goddess's promise, once given, would not be denied. As the sun dipped low behind the hills of Sparta, the palace began to shimmer in the rose-colored light of evening. In that hour between day and night, when the world softened into dream, Helen felt her heart tilt toward fate. The wind that rose from the harbor carried with it the scent of salt and myrtle. And in that scent, the first whispers of war. Evening settled softly over Sparta, as though the world itself wished to linger in stillness. The palace glowed with torchlight, and the air was rich with the scent of oil and myrrh. Guests reclined upon low couches, their laughter weaving through the music of flutes and lyres. Yet among them, unseen by all but the gods, two hearts beat with the same disquiet rhythm. Paris sat near Helen, his words calm, his tone smooth as flowing water. Yet beneath that calm ran something deeper, a reverence that bordered on awe. He spoke of Troy, of the shining plains and the towers that reached toward the clouds. Helen listened, her gaze turned toward the flickering lamps, but her thoughts were far away, drawn toward his voice as though it were a thread of destiny pulling her through time itself. When their eyes met, the room seemed to fade. In that gaze there was neither deceit nor conquest, only a strange, helpless recognition. They were as two souls who had found each other again after lifetimes apart, bound not by choice, but by something older and crueler than choice, divine design. Menelaus, ever gracious, spoke warmly of his guest. His trust was simple, honest, the kind of trust born from a man unacquainted with betrayal. He saw in Paris a reflection of his own youth, noble and unburdened by suspicion. When he departed days later for Crete, leaving Helen to tend to the palace in his absence, he kissed her brow without knowing it would be farewell. The gods, watching from their distant thrones, fell silent. Hera and Athena turned their gaze away, unwilling to witness the workings of Aphrodite's promise. The goddess of love, triumphant and serene, bent the winds to her will, and in the hush of night her whisper found Helen's ear. Helen wandered through the moonlit courtyards, her white robe brushing the marble like a sigh. Each fountain she passed reflected her face, each shadow stretched long, as if the world itself watched in waiting. Her thoughts were a storm of longing and fear, of the life she had known, and the one she could no longer resist. Paris met her there beneath the olive trees, where the sea's distant murmur blended with the sound of leaves. He did not speak at first. Words in such moments are too heavy. Instead, he knelt, as one who worships rather than wins. When Helen's hand found his, the stars above seemed to tremble. The night grew still, as though time itself paused to listen. Their first touch was not the act of mortals, but the fulfillment of a divine decree. For love, when born from the will of gods, is both blessing and curse. It lifts and destroys in the same breath. As the moon climbed higher, the world changed around them. The palace slept, unknowing, the sea shimmered with quiet approval. And in that secret stillness, love took root, not as joy, but as prophecy. By morning, the air would be different. The soft winds of Sparta would carry the scent of departure, and the gods, though silent, would already be waiting by the shore. The first light of dawn spilled across the harbor, gilding the sails and the quiet ripples of the water. Paris and Helen moved among the docked ships with the ease of those who belong to neither past nor present, yet whose steps have been guided for centuries. The oarsmen adjusted their ropes, the deck groaned softly beneath their feet, and the scent of the sea clung to everything, sharp and bracing. Helen paused at the bow, her fingers trailing along the polished wood, feeling its solidity, its readiness for departure. She turned toward Troy, a city she had never known, and in that moment understood the weight of what she carried. She was no longer simply the queen of Sparta. She was the chosen of Aphrodite, the living spark that would ignite legends and grief alike. Her heart fluttered not with fear alone, but with the strange exhilaration of surrendering to what the gods had willed. Paris approached silently, his presence a calm counterpoint to the tumult within her. The sea between them and Troy was still, yet it pulsed with invisible currents, as though the waters themselves were aware of what was about to unfold. Each breath they took seemed to echo the rhythm of oars striking the waves, the first notes of a symphony composed by destiny. As the ship began to move, gliding away from the familiar shores of Sparta, the palace receded into mist. The columns, the olive trees, the gardens where laughter had once lingered, all of it slipped quietly from view, leaving only memory and the faint ache of what was left behind. In the hush of morning, the gods spoke through wind and wave. Aphrodite's invisible hand guided them, steadying the vessel, softening the tension in the air. Yet elsewhere, across the Aegean, Hera's fury gathered like storm clouds, Athena's quiet wrath sharpening like a blade under ice. Even the sea seemed to pulse with forewarning, a silent witness to the unraveling of oaths and the birth of chaos. Helen stood at the prow, the sun warming her face and Paris by her side. Neither spoke for long, for words could not encompass the enormity of the moment. Instead, they let the silence carry them, and in that shared stillness, the first seeds of legend were sown. The ships moved past islands still veiled in morning haze, past reefs and bays that knew only the slow rhythm of tides. Each splash of water against the hull was a quiet drumbeat, announcing to the world that vows could be broken, that love could outweigh law, and that the winds of destiny were already shifting. As twilight approached on the second day, the silhouettes of distant mountains began to rise on the horizon, Troy waiting with its walls and its history, unaware of the storm approaching. The air thickened with anticipation, the scent of pine and salt blending into something both tender and ominous. In that delicate balance between sea and sky, between leaving and arriving, the world seemed suspended, holding its breath. And as the stars blinked awake above them, the murmuring of the waves seemed to carry a warning and a promise that the night would end, but the consequences of love and desire would endure beyond all measure. The evening deepened as the fleet drew closer to Troy, the mountains emerging slowly from the haze like ancient sentinels. The sun, dipped low behind the western hills, cast the city in gold and shadow, illuminating walls that had watched centuries pass, and yet had never known such a quiet, approaching tension. The air was heavy with anticipation, the scent of the sea mingling with the faint fragrance of pine and wildflowers carried from distant cliff. Helen walked among the decks, her hands tracing the railings as though to anchor herself to the present. She felt the pull of Troy even before the ships reached harbor, an unseen gravity, subtle but insistent, tugging her toward the city that would soon become both refuge and ruin. Paris followed, patient, his eyes reflecting her own apprehension, yet steady with the certainty of divine favor. Around them, the sailors moved with the rhythm of necessity, ropes coiled, sails adjusted, oars ready to catch the slightest wind. To mortal eyes, it was an ordinary arrival, a diplomatic mission disguised as travel, but to those who watched beyond the veil, it was a moment heavy with consequence. Hera's anger simmered like a distant storm, Athena's resentment sharpened into a silent edge, and Aphrodite, unseen yet present, lingered over the two mortals as both shield and instigator. As the harbor drew near, Troy's citizens began to gather along the docks. Some gazed with curiosity, others with awe, and a few with a subtle, instinctive wariness. Priam and Hecuba waited within the high walls, not yet knowing that the beauty and grace of Helen would soon bind their son's fate inexorably to hers. The city, as yet untested, seemed to inhale in quiet expectation, holding its breath for what had been decreed from Olympus. Helen's gaze fell upon the high towers and wide courtyards, gleaming with marble and sunlight, and a shiver ran through her, not of fear alone, but of a profound sense that life, as she had known it, would never return. The promise of love, once fulfilled, carried with it a weight heavier than any crown, heavier than any oath. Paris, sensing her hesitation, brushed a hand lightly over hers, and the moment felt suspended between worlds, the mortal and the divine, the past she left behind, and the destiny toward which she had been carried. As the first ropes were cast to the dock, the oarsmen fell silent, the sails furled, and the ship rested against Troy's ancient stones. The city, resplendent yet unknowing, welcomed them with calm harbor waters, unaware that the stillness was merely the hush before the storm. In that quiet, Helen felt the invisible threads of fate tighten around her heart, and Paris understood with a weighty certainty that the moment of arrival was not an end, but a beginning. The sun sank fully behind the hills, leaving Troy bathed in the soft glow of twilight, and the first stars began to tremble in the sky, as though anticipating the upheaval about to unfold. And beneath their watchful eyes, love moved quietly into legend, carrying with it the silent fury of kings yet to learn betrayal. Night fell softly upon Troy, the city wrapped in a pale glow from the rising moon. Torches flickered along the walls, and the hum of the harbor quieted as ships settled into their moorings. Within the palace of Priam, servants whispered among themselves at the sight of the foreign guests, marveling at the prince of Troy who had returned to claim his birthright. Yet even amidst polite curiosity, there lingered an undercurrent of something unspoken, a sense that the air itself had shifted, carrying with it the scent of change and inevitability. Helen, escorted through the gates by Paris, felt the cool stone beneath her feet, the echo of her footsteps blending with the hush of the city at rest. She walked beside him, glancing at the walls that had withstood centuries, yet she sensed that no fortress, however great, could withstand the force that now swept through Troy. Her pulse quickened not from fear alone, but from the awareness that every moment of stillness carried a promise and a warning. Paris led her to the chambers prepared in his name, where the flickering light of oil lamps cast gentle shadows across the walls. Here, away from the curious eyes of the city, he spoke softly, recounting the journey from Sparta, the silent devotion that had guided him, and the force of Aphrodite's will that had drawn them together. Helen listened, feeling her own heart tremble in recognition, the weight of her choices pressing upon her like a tidal wave. Though words remained few, their shared silences spoke volumes. Each glance, each subtle movement, carried a gravity neither could fully articulate. It was in these quiet exchanges that love, quiet, consuming, and inevitable, took root, intertwining their fates more firmly than the strongest oath or the highest tower. Beyond the palace walls, the city of Troy slept, oblivious to the tremors of destiny that had arrived with the foreign prince and the queen who followed. Priam, seated in his private chambers, sensed the stirrings of change and offered silent prayers to the gods, prayers for protection, for wisdom, and for mercy that he feared would not be granted. Yet in the hush of night, even the most watchful king could not foresee the coming tides of grief and glory, the unraveling of peace, or the names that would be sung in sorrow for generations. As the hours deepened, the first threads of legend were stitched into the fabric of Troy. Love and desire, blessed and cursed by divine favor, had crossed the Aegean, and with their crossing, a delicate balance shifted, one that would awaken kings, armies, and empires alike. In the quiet of the palace, with the stars wheeling slowly above, Helen and Paris stood together at a window overlooking the harbor. The sea, calm yet insistent, whispered its eternal truths, that love, once freed, cannot be contained, that destiny, once set in motion, cannot be undone, and that even the strongest walls cannot hold the heart against the tides of fate. The night deepened over Troy, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Lanterns flickered along the streets, casting long, trembling shadows against stone walls, while the distant murmur of the Aegean carried the faint scent of salt and pine. Within the palace, Helen lingered by the window, her gaze tracing the harbor where their ships rested, and her mind replayed every moment of the journey, every glance, every word, every silent heartbeat shared with Paris. She felt the weight of her choice pressing upon her like the gentle but unyielding hand of fate. Sparta, her home, was now a memory washed in moonlight, a distant shore slipping slowly behind her. The life she had known, even in its quiet comfort, had been left behind, replaced by the magnetic pull of a future she could not yet see, yet could no longer resist. Paris, ever calm beside her, felt the same currents of inevitability. The journey had not merely carried them across the sea, it had carried them into the eye of destiny itself. The gods watched still, distant and eternal, Aphrodite's soft laughter riding the wind, Hera's anger rumbling like thunder in unseen clouds, Athena's gaze cold and unforgiving. The mortal world, for all its seeming autonomy, had become the stage for forces beyond comprehension. In the harbor, the oarsmen rested, their boats anchored as the night tide settled. Somewhere in the stillness, a soft breeze stirred, rustling olive trees and carrying the distant scent of cedar and salt. It was a quiet moment, yet pregnant with portent. The calm before the storm of vengeance, the hush before the clashing of kingdoms, the space in which history itself drew a breath. Helen and Paris moved together through the palace, their footsteps soundless against the marble floors. They spoke little, for the language of hearts in such moments is not of words, but of presence, a gentle, unspoken tether that binds one soul to another. Even in silence, the pull of Aphrodite's design was unmistakable, drawing them closer while the threads of war and sorrow began to gather beyond the wall. By midnight, the stars wheeled overhead, tracing slow, eternal arcs. Each gleaming point above seemed to echo the destiny that had been woven for them, a tale of beauty and desire, of power and ruin, of love that would ignite the wrath of men and gods alike. And as the first quiet hours of the night waned, Troy, unknowing and resplendent, slept beneath the weight of what had arrived, a queen stolen, a heart surrendered, a spark struck in the darkness that would soon become a fire no fortress could contain. The first stirrings of fate whispered in the trees, drifted across the silent courtyards, and mingled with the sighing of the harbor waters. In that soft, expectant air, the story of love and betrayal continued to weave itself inexorably into legend, moving from hearts to cities, from choice to consequence. Dawn arrived slowly over Troy, brushing the city with a pale, hesitant light. The walls shimmered faintly as the sun climbed, reflecting off the marble and the river that wound through the plains. Birds began their morning songs, and the faint clatter of life returned to the streets. Yet within the palace, a different current stirred, one of silent tension, of hearts and fates poised on the edge of irrevocable change. Helen rose to greet the new day, her thoughts heavy yet resolute. She wandered through the open corridors, the gentle light illuminating her path. Each step carried with it the knowledge of the choice she had made, to follow Paris across the sea, to leave Sparta behind, to embrace a love both divine and forbidden. The air felt charged, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the energy of what was unfolding, the city quietly sensing that it had become part of a story larger than its own quiet streets and towers. Paris joined her at the balcony overlooking the harbor. The ships rested in the morning calm, their sails furled, their decks still. He looked toward the horizon, toward the distant hills of Sparta that now seemed a lifetime away. Between them, words were unnecessary. Their hearts spoke a language older than speech, conveying certainty, awe, and an unspoken acknowledgement of the path upon which they had embarked. Elsewhere, far across the sea, men began to stir in Sparta. The absence of queen and prince was slowly realized. Messengers would be sent, oaths recalled, alliances threatened, and the quiet world of law and kingship fractured by a single, irresistible current, love decreed by the gods. The winds that carried Helen and Paris also carried the invisible tremors of the future, oars cutting water, trumpets ready to sound, hearts poised for vengeance. Within Troy, Priam and Hecuba watched the arrivals from high terraces. Their faces were gentle with welcome, yet faint shadows flickered in their eyes, shadows of the prophecies whispered long ago, shadows of the warnings that fate had sewn into the threads of their lives. The palace was prepared, yet no preparation could encompass what had already begun, the intertwining of love and war, of desire and doom. And so the stolen queen moved through the halls of Troy, a living embodiment of promise and peril. Paris followed, quiet and reverent, carrying with him not only a love born of divine favor, but also the weight of what was to come. The city, unaware, hummed with ordinary life, markets opening, craftsmen beginning their work, children chasing each other through courtyards. Yet beneath the surface, a tide had begun to rise, a tide that would touch every street, every tower, every heart. As the morning sun climbed higher, the gentle sway of history carried Helen and Paris into legend. Love had arrived on silent oars, and with it the first murmurs of vengeance, the whispers of kings betrayed, the quiet turning of the world toward war. The tide of destiny moved with unerring patience, and Troy, radiant yet untested, waited beneath the sky, unknowing of the storm to come. The morning light deepened, spilling over Troy's towers and streets like liquid gold. The city awoke in ordinary rhythms, yet the air held a subtle electric charge, imperceptible to most, but palpable to those touched by fate. Within the palace, Helen moved through the halls with quiet determination. Each step was careful, measured, as though she sought to balance the weight of her desires against the unspoken consequences they carried. Paris followed silently, his presence a calm anchor against the current of uncertainty that surrounded them. The halls, decorated with tapestries of past glories and ancestral triumphs, seemed to hum with anticipation. Servants whispered among themselves at the arrival of the Queen of Sparta, noting her beauty, her grace, yet unaware that her presence carried with it the spark of war. Priam watched from a high window, sensing the weight of destiny settle across the city, though he could not yet name it. The ancient king's heart, seasoned by decades of rule, felt a tremor of unease, a forewarning that the threads of peace were already fraying. Outside, the harbor remained still, the ships swaying gently with the tide. The oars that had carried them from Sparta now rested, yet their journey had left invisible ripples, extending far beyond the calm waters. Those ripples reached across the Aegean, stirring thoughts in Sparta's court, the first murmurs of outrage, the whisper of vengeance yet to be claimed. The calm that morning was deceptive. Beneath it, the currents of anger, ambition, and divine intervention flowed like an unseen river, poised to sweep through the hearts of kings and the walls of cities alike. Helen and Paris walked together in the palace gardens, their fingers occasionally brushing, their glances lingering longer than decorum allowed. Words remained scarce, for the language of their hearts was already beyond articulation. In the quiet, they felt the weight of what had been set in motion, a love that could not be contained, a promise that would not be denied, and a future that trembled between hope and ruin. Aphrodite's unseen hand guided their steps, weaving a delicate path through mortal and divine alike, shaping a story that would echo for generations. As afternoon fell, the soft sound of oars and sails echoed from distant harbors, ships beginning to prepare, messengers stirring, plans forming across the sea. Troy remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering beyond its walls. The city, its streets bathed in golden light, seemed serene, but the first tremors of consequence had already been felt. Every glance, every choice, every quiet heartbeat was a note in a growing symphony of destiny, each carrying both wonder and peril. As night approached, the torches along the walls were lit, casting long shadows across the palace and streets. Helen and Paris stood together at a balcony, the cool evening breeze brushing their faces. The stars wheeled above, silent witnesses to love and ambition, desire and doom. The stolen queen and her prince had arrived, and the tide of destiny, slow and inexorable, began to flow, reaching far beyond the bounds of Troy, into the hearts of kings, the hands of warriors, and the unseen halls of Olympus. As the dawn light stretched across the plains of Mycenae, a hush settled over the camp. The first chapter of love and betrayal had already been written upon the waters, yet now another story of men of steel and of duty began to stir. From every corner of Greece, kings and warriors arrived, their banners snapping in the morning wind, their faces solemn beneath helmets polished to mirror the rising sun. The earth itself seemed to pause, as though awaiting the slow, inevitable march of destiny. Agamemnon, high upon the ridge overlooking the gathering, moved with measured steps. He bore the weight of command with a quiet gravity, his eyes scanning the assembled kings and heroes, each a living thread in the tapestry of war. Around him, the air trembled with anticipation, the mingled scents of salt, horses, and smoldering fires marking the passage of fate from one generation to the next. Each man present carried both pride and burden, the pride of heritage, the burden of prophecy, the unspoken knowledge that departure could mean oblivion. Among them walked Achilles, his form tall and lithe, every movement precise, every glance carrying the shadow of glory yet to come. Odysseus, careful and cunning, observed the camp as though measuring not only its readiness but the currents of chance that might sway the coming days. Ajax, towering and resolute, moved with a calm that belied the storms gathering inside him. They were heroes born of both mortal blood and divine whispers, each destined to etch a name upon the memory of the world. Families lingered on the edges of the encampment, silent witnesses to the unfolding of destiny. Wives, mothers, and children pressed to the edges of the banners, hands brushing the fabrics, faces pale with both hope and dread. The scent of burning offerings rose from altars set beneath the hills, and prayers whispered to the gods mingled with the morning wind. The blessings of earth and sky were sought, yet even these could not shield them from the inexorable tide that approached. As the oarsmen readied the ships, stretching sails taut and inspecting lines, the heroes stood at the water's edge. Time moved like a silent current, the world poised on a moment suspended between peace and destruction. Horses shifted in their stalls, the clatter of hooves softened beneath the careful hands of grooms, and the first cries of seagulls carried across the harbor. It was a morning of departure, yet one that seemed to echo across centuries, as though the land itself remembered the sorrow and valor that would walk upon it. And as the sun climbed higher, gilding the banners and casting long shadows across the harbor, the first stirrings of movement began. Ships, modest and grand alike, swayed gently, their prows pointed toward the distant horizon. The fleet was a living organism, breathing with the combined will of kings and warriors, their oars and sails aligned by the invisible hand of fate. From the hills, the whispers of the gods could almost be heard, muted, yet insistent, urging forward the tides that would soon consume both men and cities alike. The fleet stretched across the harbor like a vast constellation of wood and canvas, each ship a vessel not only of men, but of history, honor, and impending doom. Agamemnon's command carried with it the solemnity of kingship, his voice steady, deliberate, guiding the multitude with authority tempered by the weight of knowledge. Around him, captains and warriors readied their vessels, each checking lines, sails, and armor, their movements precise and ritualized. The rhythm of preparation was almost sacred, a slow cadence that seemed to echo the heartbeat of Greece itself. Achilles moved among the soldiers, his presence both inspiring and unsettling. Young men looked upon him with awe, sensing in his every gesture a promise of greatness and a shadow of peril. Odysseus, ever watchful, measured the demeanor of each shipmaster and warrior, plotting contingencies in the silence of his mind. Ajax's massive frame cut across the docks, a silent sentinel, steady as the earth, yet his eyes flickered with unspoken unease, the understanding that valor often precedes tragedy, and that even the strongest cannot forestall fate entirely. In the midst of this preparation, families lingered, clinging to the last fragile moments before the oars would strike water. Wives pressed hands to foreheads, their faces pale as they whispered prayers to the gods. Children reached out, fingers brushing armor, hair, or sleeves, trying to imprint memories that would soon be replaced by absence. Mothers murmured blessings and cautions, their voices low and rhythmic, like the pulse of earth itself. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, carrying the mingled scents of salt, burning offerings, and pressed linen. The sun climbed steadily, turning silver waves into ribbons of light, and the sound of oars striking water began to mingle with the cries of gulls and the distant calls of officers. One by one, the ships moved from the shore, a slow procession that mirrored both the grandeur and solemnity of the moment. The rhythm of departure was deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial, each vessel gliding as if through a living dream. The fleet was more than a collection of men and ships. It was a testament to the unity and ambition of Greece. Each sail bore a sigil, a symbol of lineage and pride, and each hero carried in his heart a tale yet unwritten, the seeds of glory and grief alike. And as the ships nudged away from the harbor, the first omens began to stir in the skies and the waters. Gulls circling, wind shifting, a quiet ripple across the surface of the sea, like a warning whispered by the gods. As the coastline of Greece receded into mist, the soldiers and kings alike felt the slow, almost imperceptible pull of destiny. The journey had begun, yet already it bore the weight of inevitability, a weight carried silently in the eyes of those who understood that the horizon they chased would bring both triumph and devastation, and that Troy awaited with walls and spears, unyielding and eternal. Time moved like a silent current as the fleet sailed steadily into the open Aegean. The sea stretched before them, dark and unbroken, its surface catching the first glimmers of sunlight in silver threads. Each oar stroke was a heartbeat, steady and unyielding, propelling men toward a destiny they could not yet see, yet felt in the marrow of their bones. The rhythm of the ships created a slow, hypnotic cadence, a lullaby of wood and water that spoke both of adventure and of impending sorrow. On board, warriors tended to their arms and armor, checking shields, tightening straps, and sharpening blades. The sound of metal against stone, the quiet murmur of soldiers speaking in hushed tones, and the occasional laughter of youth mingled with the slap of water against the hull. Even in the midst of duty, there was a sense of reverence, the awareness that this voyage carried the weight of not only kings and heroes, but of gods, omens, and histories yet unwritten. Achilles sat apart, gazing across the horizon. His mind wandered to the promise of glory, to the moments that would define his name for eternity, yet he felt the shadow of mortality pressing close. Odysseus, seated beside him, traced patterns on the deck with a finger, calculating, observing, always weighing the unseen tides that might shift the course of events. Ajax stood at the prow of his ship, muscles tense beneath bronze armor, a living statue of vigilance. Yet his eyes softened when he glimpsed the distant horizon, as though anticipating both the beauty and the horror that awaited. The soldiers' faces were a canvas of resolve and quiet anxiety. Many had left behind wives, mothers, and children, pressing tender hands to their shoulders or clasping a final token of remembrance. The scent of burning offerings, olive oil, and salt water mingled in the warm breeze, a subtle reminder of the lives and homes they had temporarily abandoned. Each man carried the unspoken understanding that this journey might be one way, that the first touch of Troy's soil could mark the beginning of stories they would never return to tell. The sun climbed higher, gilding the crests of waves, and the fleet spread across the open water like a great river of sails and banners. From the deck, the horizon seemed infinite, and yet each ship moved with precision, bound by oaths, by orders, and by the unseen hand of fate. The wind carried both promise and warning. It rippled the banners and whipped at cloaks, whispering secrets of battles yet to come and deaths yet unclaimed. As evening approached, the first quiet stars appeared, flickering like distant flames above the endless dark of the sea. The sailors rested, leaning against the decks, their conversations hushed, their eyes reflecting both exhaustion and anticipation. Somewhere beyond the reach of sight, the gods watched silently, allowing mortals to feel the fragile autonomy of their own choices even as destiny tightened its grip. The fleet sailed onward, carrying not only men and weapons, but grief, hope, and the first echoes of legend. Each ship moved like a slow, deliberate drumbeat against the vastness of the ocean, a procession that would mark the beginning of a story sung and mourned for centuries to come. Night fell over the open sea, draping the fleet in a deep velvet hush. Lanterns swung gently from masts, casting flickering reflections upon the water, while the steady rhythm of oars striking the waves created a quiet music, a lullaby of purpose and foreboding. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and eternal, indifferent to the mortal dramas unfolding beneath them. In their silent, patient light, the men of Greece felt both small and exalted, aware that their actions would echo long after the oars ceased their movement. On board, soldiers settled into uneasy rest. Some whispered prayers to gods both distant and near, seeking protection, favor, or at least the courage to meet whatever awaited them. Others stared across the dark water, eyes catching faint outlines of islands or the shimmer of distant lights, wondering what Troy might truly be like and what fate awaited those who first set foot upon its shore. Each thought was tempered by a tension they could not name, a weight that seemed to press upon their chests like the slow pull of the tide. Achilles, restless even in this quiet, walked the deck, his gaze tracing the horizon. Thoughts of glory and vengeance, honor and mortality twisted together in his mind. Odysseus observed him, noting the subtle shifts of posture and expression, the way a hand clutched a strap or a jaw tightened at some private calculation. Ajax leaned against the railing, silent and steadfast, the muscles of his frame taut with the anticipation of battle, yet softened by the stillness of night and the distant song of waves. The fleet seemed almost to breathe in unison, the motion of ships and sailors creating a rhythm that carried the weight of centuries. The oars dipped and rose, sails caught the faintest breeze, and even the cries of seabirds overhead seemed to harmonize with the quiet unfolding of destiny. Here, upon the open water, time slowed, each moment elongated, allowing the men to feel both the enormity of their task and the fragility of their mortal existence. Beyond the human eye, the gods stirred imperceptibly. Hera's anger simmered quietly, a storm beneath the calm, while Athena's measured gaze sought to balance strategy with consequence. Aphrodite lingered, invisible, casting subtle favor upon those who would serve her designs, weaving love and desire into the fates of men. Even Poseidon, whose domain was the restless sea itself, observed with a subtle curiosity, the ripples of his realm carrying both threat and promise. As dawn approached, the first faint light brushed the horizon. The water, once black as ink, began to shimmer with silver, and the fleet, vast and solemn, moved like a river of giants across the awakening sea. In these hours, the men of Greece felt the fragile weight of history pressing upon them, the quiet grief of wives left behind, and the unspoken tension of promises yet to be tested. Every oar stroke was a heartbeat, every sail a whisper of destiny. And as the light strengthened, revealing glimpses of distant coasts, the fleet continued onward, unaware that Troy lay ahead, silent, imposing, eternal. The world held its breath, and the first edges of legend began to take shape upon the rippling waves. The morning unfolded slowly, painting the sea in shades of gold and pale blue. Mist curled along the distant horizon, blurring the line between sky and water, as though the world itself hesitated to reveal what lay ahead. The fleet pressed onward, a solemn procession of oars, sails, and banners, moving with the quiet dignity of inevitability. Each ship bore men whose names would echo through history, heroes whose valor and fate were already entwined with the city of Troy. Achilles' ship led the way, his presence both a beacon and a shadow. His thoughts were restless, turning over the unshaped days to come, the battles he would fight, the honor he would seek, and the cost of both. Odysseus, seated nearby, traced the currents and the clouds with careful calculation, anticipating not only the geography of the sea, but the unseen currents of human ambition and divine influence that would shape the campaign. Ajax, silent as a sentinel, kept his gaze forward, feeling the tension of every breath taken, every oar stroke that carried them closer to destiny. The men aboard the ships moved with practiced care, securing lines, adjusting sails, and checking arms. Their murmured conversations were heavy with anticipation, lightened occasionally by the nervous laughter of young warriors, unaware yet of the storm they were sailing into. Between them and the horizon stretched the endless sea, carrying both promise and peril. The air smelled of salt, myrrh, and distant pine, a reminder of the lands they had left behind and the lands they were about to confront. On shore, families mourned quietly, their grief wrapped in prayers and silent tears. Wives, mothers, and children pressed tokens to their hearts, holding on to fleeting connections that would soon be replaced by absence. The altars still smoldered with offerings of incense and oil, the smoke curling into the morning light, a fragile bridge between mortal hands and divine attention. Even the hills seemed to lean closer, as if listening to the quiet farewells whispered across the wind. The wind began to pick up, tugging at the sails and filling the air with a gentle roar, as if the sea itself were alive with anticipation. Waves lapped softly against the hulls, carrying reflections of banners and helmets across their shimmering surfaces. Time seemed suspended, each oar stroke a metronome measuring the slow unfolding of history. And somewhere beyond the veil of human perception, the gods shifted imperceptibly, nudging events forward, watching the tide of consequence rise and swell with careful, eternal patience. As the sun climbed higher, the distant outline of islands began to emerge, dark shapes rising from the silver-blue horizon. The fleet maintained its measured course, each ship a silent vessel of courage, sorrow, and the unspoken understanding that Troy would not yield easily. And in the hush between waves and wind, the first tremors of what was to come whispered across the water, threading their way into the hearts of men whose names would be sung and mourned for ages. By late afternoon, the horizon had begun to shift, revealing the faint, jagged outline of Troy. The city rose slowly from the haze, its walls and towers gilded in the sun's dying light, majestic and silent, as though it had always known the tides of fate would bring this fleet to its shores. The wind carried the scent of pine, cedar, and the distant smoke of hearth fires, mingling with the salt and sweat of men who had traveled leagues upon leagues, each oar stroke drawing them closer to legend. The fleet moved with solemn precision. Ships, laden with men and horses, stretched across the water like a river of purpose. The banners fluttered in the breeze, each sigil a testament to lineage, valor, and the silent oaths that bound mortals to one another and to the unseen gaze of the gods. The oarsmen's rhythm was steady, almost hypnotic, a cadence that mirrored the slow, inevitable pulse of destiny itself. On deck, the heroes prepared in silence. Achilles' gaze remained fixed upon the distant city, his mind a swirl of anticipation and foresight. He thought of the battles to come, of the glory that awaited, yet even in the promise of triumph, he felt the shadow of mortality pressing close. Odysseus, ever thoughtful, charted not only the sea but the currents of human pride and divine influence, calculating how one choice could ripple across kingdoms and centuries. Ajax, massive and resolute, remained poised at the prow, a silent sentinel against the unknown. Within each ship, soldiers murmured prayers and recounted memories of hearth and home. Many clutched talismans or tokens pressed to their hearts, fragile anchors to a life temporarily left behind. Mothers, wives, and children, though unseen, lingered in these tokens, whispering their love across the miles. The fleet was more than a gathering of men. It was a mosaic of emotion, duty, and unspoken understanding, bound together by oaths and destiny alike. As twilight deepened, the first lanterns on Troy's walls flickered to life. The city, majestic and seemingly untested, stood as both goal and omen, its silence carrying a weight heavier than stone. The gods, unseen yet ever present, watched the approach. Hera's wrath simmered like a gathering storm. Athena's quiet judgment observed the mortal choices. Aphrodite's hand subtly guided the currents, weaving desire and destiny into the fabric of men's hearts. Night fell fully as the ships began to anchor near the shore. The oars dipped once more, carrying the last measure of movement before the long hours of silence. Horses pawed gently at the decks, soldiers murmured their final prayers, and the water lapped softly against hulls, carrying the echo of a world holding its breath. In that quiet between land and sea, love and war, anticipation and dread, the first threads of history settled upon Troy, silent yet unyielding, ready to be tested by the feet of mortals, the will of kings, and the gaze of gods. And so the fleet lingered upon the horizon, 1,000 ships poised at the edge of legend, their presence a quiet harbinger of the storm to come. The silent shore waited, unaware that it would soon be filled with the echoes of spear and shield, of grief and glory, of love both stolen and consecrated by the will of Olympus. As the fleet of Greece lingered on the horizon, the city of Troy stood radiant and unyielding, its walls gleaming like burnished gold beneath the morning sun. From the heights of the palace, Priam surveyed his city with a ruler's weary wisdom, aware that the peace he had long nurtured was fragile, and that the fate of his sons, his people, and his kingdom teetered on the edge of a silent precipice. The towers reflected the light in brilliance, yet beneath their gilded stones, shadows lengthened, shadows that carried the quiet, inexorable weight of war. Hector, son of Priam, patrolled the outer gates, his armor catching the sunlight in a muted shimmer. Every movement, every gesture was deliberate, a combination of discipline and ritual born of years of training and vigilance. Yet even he could feel the stirrings of unease in the air, a tension that clung like mist to the stones and the people moving within them. Andromache, standing in the inner chambers of the palace, whispered prayers to the gods who lingered far above, her words soft, almost inaudible, yet filled with a deep and trembling hope. Her hands pressed to the stone altar, palms open, offering supplication to deities whose attention seemed distant, if not absent entirely. The city itself was alive in a curious rhythm, merchants arranging wares in courtyards, children chasing one another beneath the arches, and the scent of bread and olives rising from kitchens, mingling with the salt from the harbor and the resin of distant pines. All of this shimmered beneath the light, a vision of splendor, yet the citizens moved with an unspoken sense that the world beyond their walls was changing, that the calmness was only the surface of something much larger. In the harbor, scouts reported the movement of the Greek fleet, their words carried swiftly to the palace. Priam's gaze lingered upon the horizon, noting the distant shapes of sails and banners moving steadily with the wind. Even in this moment of measured observation, he understood the inevitability. The gods had set their designs in motion, and Troy's golden walls, for all their brilliance, could not shield its hearts from the storms gathering beyond the sea. The tension rippled through the streets like an unspoken pulse. Soldiers sharpened their spears, checked armor, and whispered counsel to one another, each aware that their lives were tethered not only to the strength of their bodies, but to the favor of gods who might intervene or abandon them at will. The marketplace, the temples, and the towers all seemed to shimmer with an uneasy anticipation. The golden walls a testament to human ingenuity. The hearts within them braced for trials yet unseen. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, casting long shadows along the city's outer gates, Hector's eyes rested upon the distant plains. The first outlines of the Greek encampment could now be discerned, glimmering in the haze above the water. The faint ripple of banners, the shimmer of bronze, and the rhythmic movement of oars spoke of inevitability. Each stroke, each sail, carried the weight of destiny closer to Troy's gates, and within the walls, the people paused in their labors, sensing, though unable to name it, that the hush before the storm had begun. Hector moved through the streets of Troy, his steps measured, his eyes attentive to every movement. Children played near fountains, unaware of the gathering shadow that stretched from the sea, and women carried baskets of bread and fruit, their faces pale with quiet apprehension. Every sound, every scent, every flicker of movement seemed magnified in the hushed tension that had begun to settle over the city. Even the stones beneath his sandals seemed to hum with the memory of battles past and the promise of those yet to come. Inside the palace, Andromache continued her silent prayers, kneeling beside the altar as incense smoke spiraled into the high vaulted ceilings. Her whispered words were a delicate melody of hope and fear, a fragile offering to gods who had remained distant. She pressed her fingers to the carved stone, feeling its cool hardness beneath her touch, imagining that her devotion might create some small shield for her husband, her city, and the sons yet to grow in the warmth of her care. Meanwhile, Priam convened his council in the shadowed halls of the palace, the room filled with maps, tokens, and the faint scent of burning oil. His advisors spoke in hushed tones, their voices cautious, weighed down by the understanding that the shadow upon the sea was no ordinary threat. The Greek fleet, numbering countless ships, bore not only warriors but legends, men whose names would echo across generations, whose deeds would shape the very fabric of history. Priam's face, lined with age and tempered by wisdom, betrayed the faint tremor of uncertainty. Even the most careful planning could not fully anticipate the designs of the gods. Beyond the walls, the first scouts of Troy's army rode lightly across the plain, their eyes scanning the distant horizon. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and wood, and with it an unspoken message. The enemy drew near. The soldiers returned to the city with quickened steps, their reports delivered in whispers to those in command. The streets of Troy, once alive with ordinary routine, began to hum with preparation. Archers checked their quivers, spear points were sharpened, and the gates were examined and reinforced. Each act, each measured movement was a quiet declaration. Troy would not yield without witness. Even as the sun began its descent, casting a golden hue over towers and battlements, the city's rhythm remained deliberate and solemn. From the heights of the walls, scouts could see the tiny silhouettes of the Greek ships gliding across the waves, each one a promise of confrontation. The air, warm with sunlight and tinged with salt, seemed to hold its breath, as though anticipating the first clash that would echo across plains, walls, and hearts alike. And so the golden city stood, radiant and enduring, yet braced against the tide that approached. Within its walls, hearts both brave and fearful waited, and the first threads of inevitability began to weave themselves into the fabric of Troy's destiny. The shadow of war, invisible yet palpable, stretched slowly across the land, preparing to meet the resolve of those who had built their lives and their homes beneath the gleam of the sun. The first evening fell with a strange, measured beauty. The golden walls of Troy shimmered beneath the fatting sun, their radiance mirrored in the river that wound through the city, while shadows lengthened across the courtyards and temples. Within these streets, life continued in careful cadence, yet an undercurrent of tension ran through every motion. Servants whispered behind doors, soldiers drilled with quiet intensity, and mothers lingered at thresholds, holding children close as if to shield them from the invisible hand of destiny. Hector, vigilant and unrelenting, moved along the ramparts, his gaze sweeping the distant plains where the Greek encampment had begun to take shape. The sight of thousands of banners, sails, and marching men stirred a calm yet formidable determination within him. He understood the weight of his responsibility, to protect not only the city but the hearts of those he loved, the lives of those entrusted to his command, and the legacy of his father's reign. Yet even as he paced, there was a silent acknowledgement that fate had already begun its careful weaving, and that the first clash of steel and spears could not be fully postponed. Within the palace, Andromache prepared offerings and blessings, arranging them with meticulous care. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured oil into bronze vessels, igniting the sacred flames that spiraled smoke toward the vaulted ceilings. Each prayer was a delicate thread, an attempt to bridge mortal vulnerability and divine will. She thought of Hector, of the children yet to be born, and of the unknown trials that loomed beyond the horizon. The golden walls, dazzling in the twilight, seemed to hold a fragile promise of safety. Yet she knew instinctively that no fortress could protect hearts from the designs of gods and men. Priam convened his council once more as darkness deepened. Advisors spoke softly of strategy, of the placement of archers, of the marshalling of troops along the outer gates. The king's eyes, reflecting both age and foresight, rested often on the distant sea, where the first glint of silver sails hinted at the approaching storm. Though every precaution was considered, he understood the limits of mortal planning. War was not a matter of mere logistics, but of courage, chance, and divine interference. Each map, each report, each whispered counsel was a measure against uncertainty. Yet the unknown remained vast and unyielding. The air cooled, carrying the mingled scents of salt, olive trees, and faint smoke from hearth fires. From the outer walls, the low murmur of the city blended with distant cries of scouts reporting movement across the plain. The night deepened, and the first sentinels returned with word of the enemy drawing nearer, their voices a quiet hum beneath the stars. Within Troy, every heart, from prince to commoner, sensed the unspoken tension that filled the golden city. And so, as darkness settled fully, the city of Troy braced itself. The contrast between brilliance and dread grew sharper. Golden towers gleamed even as shadows thickened across courtyards and streets. Within the city, preparation and prayer, courage and fear mingled like threads in a tapestry yet unfinished. And beyond the walls, the sea carried a silent promise of confrontation, of dust rising over the plains, and of the first clash that would mark the beginning of legend. Night deepened over the city, casting long shadows across the streets and courtyards. The golden walls glowed faintly beneath the light of a crescent moon, their brilliance softened into a muted radiance, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Soldiers patrolled the battlements, their armor glinting in the pale light, each step deliberate, each movement a testament to vigilance honed by discipline and love for their home. The faint clatter of hooves on stone and the soft creak of gates stirred echoes across the silent towers. Hector remained atop the highest rampart, gazing toward the distant horizon where the faint shimmer of sails marked the advance of the Greek fleet. Though the city slept in uneasy intervals, he felt the weight of anticipation pressing upon him like the tide itself. His hand rested upon the hilt of his sword, yet he knew that even the sharpest blade could not alone shield Troy from the currents of fate. He thought of Andromache, of the children sleeping in the palace, and of the city's innocent hearts now poised at the edge of turmoil. Inside the palace, Andromache moved quietly among the chambers, tending lamps and arranging offerings with solemn care. Her hands, gentle yet firm, pressed sacred oils into bronze bowls, sending spirals of fragrant smoke toward the vaulted ceiling. Every prayer, every whispered name was a fragile plea for protection, a fragile thread woven against the vast tapestry of destiny. She imagined the city under siege, the clash of warriors upon the plains, the thunder of hooves and the cries of the fallen, and yet she prayed with the quiet certainty that even small devotion might ripple through the hearts of gods. Priam lingered in his council chamber, reviewing reports from scouts and messengers. Maps were spread across the polished stone table, marked with lines of movement and symbols of strategy. Even as the king's mind traced the paths of men and horses, he was acutely aware of forces beyond mortal reckoning. The gods had placed their gaze upon Troy and upon its enemies, and every measure of human foresight was tempered by divine intervention. Plans were made, strategies considered, but beneath them all lay the truth. The first clash could not be forestalled indefinitely. The city's quiet streets seemed to hold a strange resonance. Distant chants from priests mingled with the soft murmur of sentinels, the rhythmic creak of gates, and the muted clatter of armor being polished. In the harbor, the water reflected moonlight in shimmering patches, like scattered fragments of silver upon dark glass. Troy, in all its splendor, moved in measured preparation, unaware of the precise moment when the storm would break upon its gate. And as the night deepened, the first sparks of confrontation began to stir. Somewhere across the plain, the Greek army moved in slow, deliberate patterns, forming ranks and aligning banners. The city of gold, radiant and enduring, felt the tension coil like a serpent along its walls. Dust would rise, shields would clash, and the song of war would soon echo across plains and towers alike. Within the city, hearts beat with a mix of courage, fear, and resolve, and the shadow of the coming storm stretched long beneath the moon's gentle glow. The first light of dawn crept slowly over Troy, gilding the towers and streets with a soft, trembling brilliance. Smoke from the palace hearths mingled with the morning mist, carrying the scent of incense, bread, and distant pine. Soldiers moved along the walls with disciplined precision, checking weapons, tightening straps, and murmuring low prayers to gods whose favor was uncertain. Each man carried the quiet understanding that this day would be unlike any other, that the sun would witness both valor and sorrow in equal measure. Hector stood upon the ramparts, his eyes tracing the distant plains where the Greek forces now formed ranks. Each banner, each gleaming helm was a silent herald of the confrontation to come. In the hush of early morning, the wind whispered across the fields, stirring dust and the faint scent of salt, as though the world itself anticipated the clash of armies. He felt a tremor of tension within his chest, a mixture of pride, duty, and the faint, inevitable sorrow that accompanies those who know the weight of leadership. Within the city, life continued with deliberate care. Andromache moved among the inner chambers, adjusting lamps and tending sacred offerings. Her hands pressed with reverence upon bowls of oil, her murmured prayers rising in a fragile spiral to the vaulted ceilings above. Each invocation was a plea for the safety of those she loved, a fragile thread stretched across the expanse between mortal vulnerability and divine will. Her gaze lingered on the horizon, imagining the unfolding of battles that would mark the first steps of history upon Troy's plains. Priam convened his council once more, his voice calm but grave. Advisors spoke softly of the placement of archers, the reinforcement of gates, and the positioning of cavalry along the outer walls. Their words were measured, deliberate, each syllable chosen to prepare the city for the storm that would soon break. Maps were traced with careful fingers, arrows placed to indicate lines of attack, yet all of it felt small against the immensity of what approached. The first clash of spears, the thunder of hooves, and the cries of warriors would soon render theory into reality. Beyond the walls, the Greek army moved with disciplined care. Thousands of men, armored and resolute, advanced across the plains, their shields catching the dawn's first light, their banners fluttering in quiet harmony. The oars that had carried them across the sea were now silent, replaced by the steady march of feet, the clink of metal, and the soft shuffle of horses. Time itself seemed to stretch, each step measured, each breath drawn with the awareness that destiny was at hand. As morning gave way to noon, the city of Troy shimmered like a jewel poised against the encroaching tide of war. The golden walls, radiant and enduring, concealed hearts both brave and fearful, each one aware of the shadow that had grown across the plains. The first clatter of metal against metal echoed faintly in the distance, a harbinger of the storm to come. Within the walls, the citizens and soldiers alike held their breath, balancing the radiance of their city against the inevitability of conflict that waited just beyond the horizon. The sun rose higher, casting long, trembling shadows across the plains that stretched before Troy. From the walls, Hector observed the distant figures of Greek soldiers, the glint of bronze armor, and the steady flutter of countless banners. Each movement, measured and deliberate, was a reminder that the calm of Troy was fragile, a thin veneer over a world about to be unsettled. Dust stirred faintly in the wind, carrying with it the scent of earth and salt, and the city seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Within the palace, Andromache lingered near the inner chambers, her hands folded, her gaze distant. She traced the familiar lines of the walls, the familiar curves of doorways and arches, and in each detail she sought a sense of permanence that the world beyond could not guarantee. Her prayers, soft as whispered wind, spiraled toward the vaulted ceilings, threads of devotion meant to reach the gods who, thus far, had remained silent. Every beat of her heart carried the weight of hope and fear. A delicate balance she held for her husband, her sons, and the city itself. Priam, in the shadowed council chamber, spoke quietly with his sons and generals, each word deliberate and tempered with care. Plans were laid for archers, for reinforcements along the gates, and for the deployment of cavalry across the surrounding plains. Yet beneath all strategy lay the acknowledgement of forces unseen, the favor of gods, the unpredictability of human will, and the inexorable tide of fate. Each plan was a small measure against inevitability, a fragile attempt to carve order from the vast uncertainty of war. The city itself moved with quiet urgency. Soldiers checked weapons one last time, the glint of bronze and steel catching in the sunlight. Archers pulled strings, testing tension and accuracy. Infantry tightened shields and adjusted helmets. Gates were secured and reinforced. The hum of preparation stretched through the streets, carrying with it the mingled scents of oil, burning offerings, and the faint brine of the nearby sea. Even the stones beneath their feet seemed to hum with memory, recalling past sieges, past valor, and the whispered echoes of mortality and courage. Beyond the walls, the Greek army halted at the edge of the plain. Spears and shields were aligned in careful formation, the banners held high in defiance and pride. The silence before the storm was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of armor, the shifting of horses, and the soft murmur of commands carried from one end of the line to the other. The plain itself seemed to pulse with expectation, as though the earth remembered countless battles and waited once more for the song of war to rise. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the first clash began. Dust rose from the distant plains as spears met shields, a low murmur that would swell into the roar of conflict. The golden towers of Troy reflected the sunlight even as the earth trembled beneath the advance of men. Within those walls, hearts both bold and trembling braced for the inevitable, and the city, radiant yet vulnerable, stood poised at the edge of legend. The roar of the sea had long faded behind the fleet, yet the echo of battle now filled the air like a living tide. Troy's plains were already stained with dust and shadow, and amidst the clamoring of men, one figure moved with a presence both magnetic and terrible. Achilles, son of Peleus, stood at the center of this unfolding storm, his armor catching the pale glimmer of dawn, his eyes darkened by an inner fire that no mortal could fully temper. His name carried both awe and dread, for to witness him was to see the living embodiment of pride, wrath, and inevitability intertwined. The quarrel with Agamemnon had begun in whispers and tempers, but it now festered into a chasm too wide to cross. Words of honor and insult echoed through the Greek camp, staining the air with tension that only time and fate could unravel. Achilles, wounded in spirit, retreated from the front lines, leaving others to bear the brunt of combat while his own heart simmered with unspoken fury. His pride, sharp and unyielding as the edge of a blade, drew him away from deeds of immediate glory. Yet the tension in every line of his body betrayed a storm that would not be long contained. Patroclus, his closest companion, recognized the peril in silence. The young warrior had worn Achilles' armor into battle, a symbol of borrowed strength, and the Greeks pressed forward beneath its borrowed glory. But even the bravest of men cannot outrun fate, and the shadow of death moved silently across the plain. The clash of spears, the cry of horses, and the groan of the dying filled the air, but amidst the tumult, a single spark, the fall of Patroclus, ignited a fire within Achilles, heart that no man could quench. The news reached him as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the tents and banners of the Greek camp. Silence fell first, an unbearable hush, as if the world paused to measure the loss. And then the storm within him broke. The grief of loss and the sting of dishonor fused into a singular, unrelenting fury. Achilles' heart beat like a drum of war, echoing through the corridors of mortality and legend alike. Every thought became a blade, every memory a flash of light, and every heartbeat the herald of vengeance yet to come. Even the gods stirred at the magnitude of his rage. Athena's eyes flickered with concern, Hera observed with a distant caution, and even Aphrodite lingered near, sensing the intertwining of love, grief, and anger. For in Achilles, wrath, human and divine forces converged, creating a tempest that would shape the fates of men, cities, and empires. The battlefield itself seemed to tremble in anticipation, the dust rising from Troy's plains like a veil between mortality and eternity. And so, in the hush before the storm of blades, Achilles donned his armor once more, each plate and strap a declaration. His spear glinted with the promise of retribution, his shield poised to meet both death and glory. The pulse of the war itself now throbbed through him, and in the reflection of his eyes the fires of vengeance flickered, wild and magnificent. The plain awaited him, Troy stood against him, and destiny, long patient, prepared to meet the fury of one man whose wrath could alter the course of legend. The morning broke with a muted brilliance, casting pale light across the tents and ranks of the Greek army. Even amidst the careful preparations of soldiers and commanders, the shadow of Achilles' absence weighed heavily. His wrath had not only withdrawn him from battle, but had left a gaping void in the tide of courage and strength. Men whispered in quiet fear and admiration, speaking his name with reverence, as though it were both a prayer and a warning. Each thought of him carried the pulse of the coming storm, for they knew that the fury he bore could neither be tempered nor delayed. Patroclus had fallen not by mere chance, but at the hands of a fate that intertwined mortal bravery with divine will. Hector's spear had found its mark, piercing the armor and spirit of the young companion. The loss echoed across the Greek camp, a solemn drumbeat of grief that would not be softened by consolation. Word traveled swiftly, carried by runners and messengers, until it reached Achilles in the stillness of his private tent. The grief he felt was profound, a wound deeper than any flesh could bear, yet it was laced with the sharpened edge of wrath. He moved through the camp like a shadow now lit by inner fire. Soldiers gave way, sensing the intensity that radiated from him. His spear, polished and lethal, caught the sunlight in fleeting glimmers as he tested its balance. The shield, etched with symbols of lineage and legend, felt heavier now, weighted by the inevitability of what he would do. Every motion was precise, deliberate, yet underlain with the trembling current of grief that made each step resonate like a drum of fate. The air carried scents of oil, burning offerings, and the faint metallic tang of weaponry sharpened for battle. Horses pawed at the ground, soldiers tightened straps and tested bowstrings, and the chorus of preparation blended with the distant cries from the plains of Troy. All of it seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a world on the edge, suspended between the stillness of grief and the chaos of the storm that would soon break. In that tension, Achilles' fury was both instrument and herald, a force ready to transform loss into legend. He paused briefly, gazing toward the distant walls of Troy. Golden towers glimmered in the morning light, yet their brilliance seemed a fragile veil over what was to come. Within those walls, Hector and the defenders would soon meet a force unlike any before, a tempest born of grief, honor, and unyielding wrath. And even the gods, unseen yet ever present, adjusted their gaze, knowing that the pulse of vengeance now beating in mortal heart would shape events far beyond the plains, far beyond the city, and far beyond the reckoning of men alone. The world seemed to hold its breath as Achilles moved to the forefront. Every warrior in the Greek camp felt the shift in the wind, the tension in the earth beneath their feet, and the subtle vibrations in the air that spoke of approaching cataclysm. And in the hush, before the first clash of shield against spear, the pulse of destiny began to quicken, measured by the unrelenting beat of one man's rage. The first march toward Troy began under a sky that seemed to hold its breath, pale and unwavering, as though it too sensed the enormity of what was unfolding. Achilles strode at the head of his contingent, his armor a flash of bronze and shadow, his spear glinting faintly in the morning light. Soldiers fell into formation behind him, their faces a mixture of resolve, awe, and quiet fear. The name of Achilles, whispered across ranks and courtyards, had become a drumbeat that echoed in every heart, shaping courage and dread alike. Patroclus, death had not merely wounded Achilles. It had ignited a flame that would consume hesitation, restraint, and even mercy. Every memory of his companion surged with unbearable clarity, the laughter shared in quiet moments before battle, the counsel offered in times of doubt, the bond forged through shared victories and defeats. These recollections sharpened his wrath into something both magnificent and terrible, a force that could turn the tide of war and carve his name deep into the annals of legend. As the Greek forces advanced across the plains, the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of anticipation. Dust rose from the hooves of horses and the marching feet of soldiers, mingling with the tang of iron and the distant scent of Troy's walls. The city, bathed in sunlight, appeared serene from afar, yet Hector's vigilant eyes peered from the ramparts, sensing the approach of a force unlike any they had faced before. The contrast of calm towers against the swelling storm of men underscored the inevitability that awaited all who would stand against Achilles. Wrath. The clash began quietly at first, almost imperceptibly. Spears struck shields, and the low hum of armored bodies colliding rose into a measured crescendo. Achilles remained just beyond the initial fray, observing the unfolding of events with a mind sharpened by grief and a heart inflamed by vengeance. His presence was a silent drumbeat to which the actions of others now responded, a magnet of destiny around which chaos would spiral. Inside the Greek camp, leaders murmured among themselves, noting the surge of momentum that seemed to radiate from Achilles' every motion. Odysseus and Agamemnon exchanged looks of concern and awe, knowing that the balance of power in the field could shift with a single command or a single strike from this man, whose wrath now drove both the living and the dead into the shadow of legend. Each heartbeat of Achilles seemed to echo across the plains, a rhythm marking the passage of fate itself, and every motion of his spear and shield carried the weight of human and divine consequence alike. The sun climbed higher, and the heat of day mingled with the rising tension. Dust swirled, the clang of bronze rang sharp against the hush of the surrounding hills, and the cries of warriors echoed across the plain like distant thunder. Amidst it all, Achilles' eyes remained fixed upon the distant walls of Troy, the golden towers gleaming in defiance, and the knowledge of Patroclus, absence burning in every calculated movement. Grief and rage, inseparable now, guided his hand and sharpened his will, and so the storm of vengeance gathered strength, each motion a prelude, each breath a portent. The pulse of the war itself had taken form in one man's fury, and the plains of Troy waited, silent yet trembling, for the wrath of Achilles to spill forth in fire, blood, and legend. The first clash of wills and weapons rang out like distant thunder, reverberating across the plains of Troy. Shields met spears with a harsh ringing sound, and the dust of countless feet rose to mingle with the haze of the early sun. Though Achilles had not yet fully entered the fray, his presence was palpable, a force that shaped the rhythm of battle. Soldiers found courage in his reputation, yet fear shadowed every heart, for they sensed the storm that was gathering just beyond the front line. Hector, the ever-vigilant guardian of Troy, moved along the battlements, observing the unfolding chaos with measured attention. Each clash, each shout, each cry of wounded men etched itself into his mind like a prelude to tragedy. The golden towers of Troy shimmered in the sunlight, yet even their brilliance could not mask the tension now coiling within the city's wall. Andromache's prayers continued in the palace, rising like fragile smoke into the heavens, a delicate offering to gods whose silence was both cruel and inevitable. At last, Achilles stepped onto the battlefield. The earth seemed to tremble beneath his presence. Every movement he made radiated power and precision, yet it was the fire within the burning grief of Patroclus, the sting of dishonor, the relentless pulse of wrath that made him more than mortal. Spears met shields, swords clashed, and the cries of men rose like waves breaking against the shore. With each step, he carved a path not only through soldiers, but through the very fabric of fate, bending it to the force of his rage. The Greek army moved in concert with him, their courage bolstered by the return of their champion. Odysseus, Ajax, and other leaders followed closely, aware that the tide of battle now surged on the pulse of Achilles' fury. Every foe who faced him felt the weight of legend pressing upon them, and every ally drew strength from the presence of one whose wrath seemed unstoppable, magnificent, and terrible. Even the gods watched with unease. Athena's eyes narrowed, careful and calculating, while Hera observed with a cautious admiration, knowing that the mortal wielding such wrath could alter the balance of entire realms. The wind itself seemed to bend to his movement, carrying the sounds of clash and cry across the plains. Dust swirled in his wake, as though the earth itself recognized the singularity of his presence, and the hum of destiny quickened, echoing through the hearts of warriors and the streets of Troy alike. Time seemed to stretch and fold under the weight of his fury. Each strike, each motion of his spear was both measured and untamed, a delicate balance of skill and raw emotion. Every heartbeat became a drum marking the rhythm of vengeance, and every clash of bronze and iron was a note in the terrible symphony that he alone conducted. In the distance, the golden towers of Troy seemed to shimmer with anticipation, as though they too understood the inevitability that was moving toward them, unstoppable and inexorable. And so the plains of Troy became a stage where grief and pride, wrath and destiny, converged in a single magnificent storm. Achilles, the embodiment of fury, moved at its center, and the story of the war itself began to take shape, written in the sweat, blood, and courage of men who dared to meet the pulse of a hero's rage. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp light upon the plains and gilding the edges of spears, shields, and helmets alike. Dust rose in eddies around the clashing soldiers, mingling with the copper tang of blood and the faint smoke of distant fires. Achilles moved like a tempest through the ranks, each motion precise yet wild, a paradox of mastery and unbridled fury. His eyes, dark and stormy, bore the weight of grief, yet burned with an intensity that demanded reckoning. Every strike he delivered was measured, yet carried the force of his sorrow and the depth of his anger, a force that seemed capable of reshaping the battlefield itself. Patroclus' death lingered as a constant shadow behind him, a quiet drumbeat of loss that propelled him forward. The memory of his companion's laughter, counsel, and loyalty twisted with anguish in Achilles' chest, igniting each movement with the flame of vengeance. Even as bodies fell around him and cries of pain rose above the hum of battle, the fire within him did not waver. It was a furious, relentless rhythm that set the pace of combat, forcing both friend and foe alike to move in its shadow, to recognize its power, and to feel its inevitability. Hector confronted him at last, a warrior shaped by duty, love, and the weight of Troy's fate. The two met in the center of the plain, where the dust lay thick and the sun struck gold against bronze. Their eyes locked, and in that silent instant the world seemed to pause, holding its breath between heartbeats. Each understood the other, Achilles the incarnation of wrath, and Hector the embodiment of courage tempered by wisdom. They were mirrors of the same inevitability, reflections of a destiny neither could fully escape. Spears shattered, shields splintered, and the clash of the two titans resonated across the field like the tolling of a somber bell. Every motion was poetry in iron and blood, every strike a verse in a song of rage, grief, and honor. The earth beneath them seemed to shudder with recognition, and even the wind carried a hush of awe as if nature itself watched the convergence of mortal and heroic will. Soldiers on both sides fell silent, observing from the edges of combat as the dance of wrath and valor unfolded in a cadence only time and fate could compose. In the distance, the walls of Troy glimmered, golden and serene against the backdrop of carnage, yet they too seemed aware of the inexorable tide that moved toward them. Inside, Andromache clutched at the edges of her veil, murmuring prayers that rose into the heavens like fragile smoke. Priam, observing from the high ramparts, felt the trembling of the city in his chest, a pulse carried not by the earth alone, but by the very threads of destiny now being woven on the plain. The gods, too, remained intent upon the spectacle. Athena's gaze followed each motion with a careful calculation. Hera's presence lingered with cautious admiration, and even Zeus, from his lofty seat, regarded the scene with the distant recognition of inevitability. In the union of grief, pride, and wrath, mortal and divine wills intertwined, producing a symphony of fury that would echo through the generation. And so, amidst the clash, the dust, and the cries of men, the pulse of Achilles' rage grew ever more consuming. Each heartbeat marked a path of vengeance, each strike a note in the terrible melody of destiny, and each breath carried the weight of grief and the inevitability of legend. The plains of Troy had become the stage upon which fury, honor, and sorrow danced, and all awaited the crescendo that only Achilles could bring. The afternoon sun poured its golden light across the battlefield, illuminating the glint of bronze and the shimmer of blood upon the plains. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and the faint, acrid tang of fire, yet amid the chaos, Achilles moved with a terrible, relentless precision. Each step he took seemed to shake the earth beneath him, a pulse that resonated through the ranks of Greeks and Trojans alike. His rage had become both shield and weapon, a force that demanded acknowledgement from every living being in its path. The clash with Hector continued, a deadly ballet that unfolded with elegance and brutality in equal measure. Spears were parried, swords deflected, and shields splintered under the unyielding force of their blows. Yet it was not mere skill that drove Achilles, it was the embodiment of wrath itself. Every motion was colored by grief, every strike infused with the memory of Patroclus. The plains echoed with the sound of metal and the cries of men, but within the heart of Achilles all else had faded. Only vengeance and the pursuit of honor remained. The Greek army surged behind him, inspired by his presence and driven by the knowledge that their greatest warrior had returned to the fray. Odysseus, Ajax, and other leaders found their courage renewed, their actions flowing in measured harmony with the tempest that was Achilles. The tide of battle, once uncertain, now leaned inexorably toward the force of his wrath, a current no mortal strategy could fully contain. Across the plain, the defenders of Troy fought valiantly, their hearts bound to the golden city they sought to protect. Yet even Hector, brave and steadfast, could sense the singularity of the threat before him. Each blow struck against Achilles felt like a ripple against the inevitable, and each strategy devised seemed to falter beneath the sheer intensity of fury incarnate. The golden towers of Troy shimmered against the haze of smoke and dust, a fragile beacon amid the storm of swords, shields, and death. Within the city, Andromache watched from the high walls, her hands folded in silent prayer. The flickering light of dawn that had softened into the harsh glare of day illuminated her grief and fear. Yet even in her worry, there was a profound understanding. Her husband, Hector, and the city he defended were caught in a current that even divine intervention could scarcely redirect. The prayers she offered rose like smoke toward silent heavens, fragile threads woven against the vast tapestry of destiny that now pulsed with Achilles' wrath. As the afternoon waned, the pace of battle intensified. Dust and smoke rose in thick clouds, cloaking the clash of spears and swords in a surreal haze. Every movement of Achilles was a proclamation, a herald of vengeance that would not be denied. Soldiers fell around him, yet the momentum of his wrath carried him forward, unstoppable and magnificent. Even the gods observed with bated breath, knowing that the mortal at the center of this storm had become more than man, a force shaping the history of nations and the memory of generations. And so the plains of Troy bore witness to a fury that would echo across time, a relentless tide of grief, pride, and vengeance. Achilles, at the heart of it, moved as both instrument and conductor, his wrath a living pulse that would mark the turning of the war itself. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the battlefield transformed into a chiaroscuro of dust, blood, and shadow. The golden light streaked across Troy's plains, glinting off spears and the polished surfaces of bronze armor, illuminating both valor and despair. Achilles, moving like a force of nature, pressed onward through the ranks of Trojans, each step a drumbeat of vengeance. The wind carried cries of warriors and the clash of steel, weaving them into a strange, mournful music that spoke of both life and death, hope and devastation. Hector, unbowed yet weary, met him again, their eyes locking in an understanding that transcended speech. In the hush between strikes, the two men seemed to acknowledge the inexorability of fate, that their meeting was not merely combat, but the fulfillment of threads spun long before their births. Every thrust, every parry became more than action. It became narrative, a story etched in motion, a poem of wrath, courage, and mortality. Soldiers around them faltered and hesitated, knowing they were witnessing a force beyond human reckoning. Patroclus' absence pressed upon Achilles with each heartbeat, each movement, a relentless reminder that grief and rage were now inseparable companions. Every swing of his spear, every shield raised, carried the weight of memory and loss. His fury no longer belonged merely to himself. It had grown into a living pulse of the war, a rhythm that dictated the tempo of battle and the measure of courage for all who faced him. Even the air seemed to hum with anticipation, thick with the charged essence of mortality and legend entwined. The Greek forces followed with renewed vigor, moving in harmony with the tempest of their champion. Odysseus and Ajax coordinated attacks, their actions in concert with the overwhelming presence of Achilles. Spears flew, shields shattered, and cries of both triumph and anguish rose in an unbroken tide. The earth itself seemed to acknowledge the magnitude of this fury, quivering beneath the march of countless feet and the thunder of horses, as though the very plains were alive with the pulse of destiny. Inside the walls of Troy, tension coiled like a living thing. Priam and his council watched from high ramparts, faces grave, hands clasped tightly upon stone. Andromache prayed with quiet intensity, envisioning the paths of spears and the faces of the fallen, a fragile bridge of hope stretched against the unyielding tide of war. Even as the city's defenders fought with valor, the shadow of Achilles' wrath fell across them, heavy and inescapable. A reminder that no fortress, no shield, and no mortal courage could wholly resist the force of one man's grief turned to fury. The afternoon faded into a muted gold, the light softening the horrors of the plain into a surreal, dreamlike haze. Dust swirled around the figures of men locked in combat, carrying whispers of cries and the metallic tang of iron. Achilles, relentless and terrible, moved like a living current, his movements shaping both the chaos of battle and the destiny of all who dwelled within its reach. In the hush between strikes, the battlefield seemed to pause, holding the echo of grief and the promise of vengeance in its breathless silence. And as the sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the plain, the pulse of Achilles' wrath surged with renewed intensity. Each heartbeat marked the inevitable unfolding of fate, and every motion of spear and shield carved a path through mortality toward legend. Troy's plains, radiant and terrible, trembled beneath the weight of grief and vengeance intertwined, awaiting the final crescendo that would shape the memory of generations yet to come. The plains before Troy lay hushed under a sky streaked with fading gold and creeping violet shadows. Dust mingled with the iron tang of blood, settling upon the bodies of fallen men as if the earth itself sought to veil the horrors of the day. The clash of shields and the cries of warriors had softened into a mournful murmur, a solemn hymn that rose and fell with the weary heartbeat of a war-weary land. Even the wind, once lively and playful, moved cautiously, carrying whispers of grief and echoes of lives extinguished too soon. Within the golden gates, Hector stood alone for a moment, surveying the battered city he had vowed to defend. Each stone, each tower, each whispering alley spoke of home, of love, of duty. His gaze fell upon the distant Greek lines, now still in preparation, their energy drained, yet still brimming with the silent anticipation of the inevitable. He knew that the weight of fate rested upon him alone, that the glory of Troy and the hopes of its people were bound to the measure of his courage. Every heartbeat carried the cadence of honor and inevitability, and in that rhythm he felt both human and timeless. Priam moved through the corridors of the palace, his steps quiet upon the worn stones. His face, lined by the years and the burden of kingship, reflected the deep sorrow of a father who had watched his sons march into storm after storm, who had witnessed the tides of war sweep through the lives of all he cherished. He paused at the walls, gazing upon the fields where the fallen lay scattered. Each life lost was a thread in the tapestry of grief, each cry a note in the symphony of sorrow that would echo long after the fires of battle dimmed. Andromache, her hands trembling over the weave of her prayers, lingered near the inner chambers, casting her thoughts upon Hector, upon her sons, and upon the fragile city they had built. The gods remained silent, distant, and unmoved, leaving mortals to navigate the frailty of their own hearts. In the hush between loss and survival, she felt the fragile pulse of hope, yet strained by the inexorable weight of despair. The city held its breath, poised at the edge of fate, knowing that the coming hours would test every measure of courage, wisdom, and human endurance. The Greek camp, too, felt the weight of exhaustion. Spears lay bent, shields bore the dents of countless blows, and warriors moved with the slow, deliberate cadence of weariness. Glory had been pursued, earned, and now seemed distant, slipping into the haze of grief that hovered over the plains. Even the strongest hearts faltered under the relentless drum of loss, and the song of war had taken on the muted tone of elegy. Above it all, the faint stirrings of prophecy moved quietly through the world. In whispered threads that escaped even the notice of gods, the fall of Troy was spoken not through force alone, but through the cunning of men whose minds were sharp as blades. The echo of this knowledge lingered in the air, a shadow over the plain and a subtle hum in the hearts of those who would shape the city's final days. As twilight deepened, the shadows of Troy stretched long across the plains, mingling with the smoke and dust that rose from the remnants of countless skirmishes. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, golden towers glowing faintly against the dimming sky, yet beneath the surface, fear and exhaustion ran like hidden currents. Within these walls, Hector moved with the measured grace of a man aware that each step might be his last. Every glance toward the battlements, every turn toward the gates, carried the weight of both duty and dread. The clash of shields and the thunder of hooves had softened, yet the tension in the air remained. Greek and Trojan warriors alike felt the invisible pull of destiny tightening its grip. Achilles' absence from the immediate field did not diminish his shadow. The stories of his wrath had reached even here, filtering into the minds of those who would face the inevitability of loss. Yet Hector stood firm, the embodiment of courage and loyalty, aware that the city's fate rested upon his shoulders. Each breath he drew seemed a delicate negotiation between the demands of honor and the whisper of mortality. Priam, seated upon a stone bench overlooking the city's central square, let his fingers brush over the carved surfaces, tracing memories as though he might anchor himself to them. His sons had fallen, or now moved like shadows on the field of war, and every glance toward the walls carried a father's grief. The night deepened, and with it came the hush of stars and the quiet resonance of sorrow. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a murmur meant for no one, a silent acknowledgement that even kings are powerless against the tides of fate. Andromache moved among the women gathered within the palace, their hands busy with minor tasks, yet their eyes drawn constantly to the horizon where battle still raged. Her prayers, though quiet and almost fragile, were no less potent, weaving a delicate thread of hope through the fabric of night. She imagined Hector's spear, his shield, the rhythm of his march, and in each imagined motion she felt the weight of impending tragedy. The silence of the gods pressed upon her, a reminder that mortal lives are the ones most exposed to the turning wheels of destiny. Across the plains, the Greek forces felt a somber stillness settling into their ranks. Spears rested against shields, banners drooped, and men's eyes lingered on the darkening horizon as though searching for some sign of what was to come. The pursuit of glory had been harshly tempered by grief, and even victories were now tinged with the melancholy of lives spent in service to a war that consumed its own children. The hum of exhaustion blended with the murmurs of strategy, creating a rhythm that was both solemn and inevitable. And so, as the last light of the sun bled into violet and the first stars emerged in quiet witness, the stage was set for the tragedies yet to unfold. The weight of mortality pressed heavily upon all, kings, warriors, and women alike, and the pulse of sorrow began its steady, unyielding march across the plains of Troy. Amidst this hush, a single thread of prophecy whispered forward, that the city's end would come not by force alone, but through the cunning and craft of men whose minds were as sharp as any blade. Night descended slowly over Troy, draping the city in a cloak of muted silver. The stars above twinkled faintly, indifferent to the suffering unfolding beneath, as if the heavens themselves had grown weary of mortal folly. In the dim light, the streets were quiet but not empty. The shadows of citizens and warriors alike moved with care, avoiding the echo of footsteps that might betray sorrow or fear. Within the palace, Hector paused in the central hall, the weight of his armor a reminder of both his duty and his humanity. Every motion, every measured breath, seemed amplified in the hush of evening, as if even the silence was listening. Outside the walls, the Greek forces remained vigilant, the watchful eyes of their commanders tracing the dim outlines of Troy against the horizon. The clash of arms had ceased for now, but tension lingered in the air, as heavy and palpable as the dust that still drifted above the battlefield. Even the youngest soldiers sensed the inevitability that threaded through each heartbeat, the quiet certainty that the night's darkness would not grant them rest. Their glances turned frequently toward the distant city, where the glow of torchlight reflected against stone, and in each flicker they glimpsed both beauty and dread intertwined. Within Troy, Priam moved to the highest balcony of the palace, gazing upon the plain where the fallen had been left in mute testimony. His eyes, weary yet unyielding, traced the contours of the city's defenses, knotting the silent gaps where life had once stood firm. Fathers, sons, and warriors alike had fallen, and their absence reverberated like a subtle echo across the marble hall. Priam's voice, low and cracked, murmured prayers to gods who remained silent, his words weaving a fragile bridge between hope and despair. Andromache, unable to bear stillness, wandered among the chambers, touching each object with a delicate reverence. She traced the edges of Hector's belongings, remembered the cadence of his voice, the strength of his hands, and the courage that had always tempered his decisions. Her heart was a chamber of grief and love intertwined, and each thought of her husband and their child resonated with a clarity sharpened by fear. The night, calm yet watchful, seemed to mirror her inner turmoil, stretching long shadows that crept across walls like silent witnesses. Even in the Greek camp, fatigue had not dulled the edges of anticipation. Soldiers prepared their positions, checked their arms, and whispered quietly, knowing that the next day might demand more than human endurance could provide. Leaders conferred with careful deliberation, their faces etched with exhaustion and the subtle weight of foreboding. The victories won, the blood spilled, and the lives lost had left a residue of sorrow upon their ranks, an invisible shroud that tempered both strategy and courage. And so, beneath the pale gaze of the indifferent stars, Troy's walls held steadfast, yet the threads of fate wove quietly through the night. The city's defenders, the grieving, and the weary alike were bound together by a tapestry of loss and courage. And through it all, the faint whisper of prophecy lingered, a reminder that while might shapes the present, the mind's cunning and foresight often write the final verse. The moon rose high above Troy, casting a silvered glow upon the golden towers, softening their brilliance into a pale, mournful light. Shadows stretched across the streets and battlements, merging with the restless figures of those who moved with purpose and unease. Hector walked along the ramparts, pausing at intervals to survey the silent plains beyond. The remnants of the day's battle lay scattered beneath him, bodies frozen in eternal gestures of struggle, and the wind carried the faint, bitter tang of blood. Every step he took seemed to echo against the walls, a solemn rhythm that marked both courage and inevitability. Within the palace, Priam's hands trembled slightly as he traced the contours of his son's armor, now stored in silent tribute. Each piece bore the imprint of life, the subtle dents and scratches that told stories of valor and sacrifice. Priam's eyes, weary and laden with grief, reflected the duality of his heart, pride in the courage of his children and sorrow for their inevitable mortality. He spoke softly to the air, addressing the gods whose faces remained hidden, whose silence was both cruel and instructive. The city's fate, he realized, was suspended on the fragile edge between human endeavor and divine indifference. Andromache, seated near the hearth, clutched her child and felt the rhythm of small, untroubled breaths. Her mind, however, wandered constantly to Hector, to the plain beyond the walls, and to the shadow of death that stretched across the city. She whispered prayers that rose like smoke, delicate threads meant to reach ears that remained silent. In the hush of night, she sensed the fragile pulse of destiny winding around them all, carrying both hope and dread in equal measure. Outside, the Greek forces kept watch, their eyes scanning the horizon for movement that might signal renewed battle. The air was still, almost suffocating in its silence, and yet beneath it ran the restless energy of men poised between exhaustion and the anticipation of tragedy. Spears were cleaned, fires tended, and the murmurs of strategy floated across the encampment like gentle currents of thought. Even in rest, the memory of the day's losses lingered, a quiet shadow that pressed upon both body and spirit. Hector returned to the gates, tracing the familiar stones with a reverent hand. Each mark upon them was a testament to Troy's resilience, and yet he knew that resilience would soon be tested beyond the measure of mortal endurance. The night deepened, and the city itself seemed to sigh, as if conscious of the fragile hearts it sheltered. The weight of leadership pressed upon Hector with every heartbeat, shaping his resolve even as it reminded him of mortality's certainty. In the quiet that followed, a whisper of prophecy drifted through the air, unseen and unheard by most, yet unmistakable in its implication. Troy would not fall by sheer might alone. Cunning, patience, and the cleverness of minds sharpened like blades would shape its final hour. The night held these secrets, woven into the stars and the shadows, a gentle reminder that even amidst grief and exhaustion, fate continued its careful weaving. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the plains, brushing the city walls with a pale, silver-gold glow. Troy stirred cautiously, aware of the fragile line between vigilance and despair. Hector moved through the gates, his armor glinting faintly in the morning light, each step deliberate, weighted with the awareness that this day might seal the fate of the city he loved. The streets remained quiet, the citizens cloaked in the shadow of uncertainty, their murmurs barely audible above the faint stirrings of the wind. The battlefield beyond the walls was still, yet charged with latent tension. Fallen warriors lay in silent testimony, their presence both reminder and warning of the cost of pride and valor. Dust clung to the ground, mingling with the lingering scent of blood and smoke from fires left smoldering overnight. Every object seemed imbued with memory, a witness to deeds of courage and desperation that would never be erased. And yet, the sun's first rays lent a strange beauty to the devastation, gilding the scene with a quiet majesty that tempered the sorrow with awe. Hector's gaze swept over the plain as he readied his men. The Greek camp across the field was a silent mirror, the soldiers poised in careful anticipation, their exhaustion tempered by vigilance. Even in rest, the weight of consequence pressed heavily upon them. Each knew that today might demand a price measured not in gold or glory, but in lives and the fragile thread of hope. Hector inhaled the cool air deeply, as though drawing strength from the very earth beneath him, grounding himself against the inexorable tide of fate. Within Troy, Priam and Andromache moved through the halls, their presence quiet yet profound. Priam's eyes lingered on the faces of those who remained, the women and children who had survived thus far, while Andromache whispered her prayers into the silent spaces of the palace. Both were aware that the coming hours would test every measure of courage, wisdom, and resilience. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, the stones of its walls heavy with anticipation, the golden towers refracting the early light into fragments that danced like fragile hopes upon the streets below. The wind shifted across the plain, carrying faint echoes of the Greek camp and the distant roar of waking men. Hector adjusted his grip on his spear and shield, the weight of his armor a constant reminder of duty and mortality. Every motion, every glance was measured against the knowledge that a hero's fall could alter the destiny of Troy itself. The city's pulse, subtle yet insistent, mirrored the rhythm of his own heartbeat, steady, determined, yet heavy with the knowledge of inevitable loss. And so, as the morning unfolded, the final chapter of many lives quietly began. The whisper of prophecy threaded through every motion, every glance, every thought. Troy's fall would come not only through the might of arms, but through the cleverness and patience of unseen hands. The weight of grief, courage, and anticipation hung in the air, and the city braced for the convergence of heroism and tragedy that was to come. By mid-morning, the plain before Troy was alive with movement, yet heavy with solemnity. The Greek forces, disciplined and wary, adjusted their positions with quiet precision. Spears glinted in the sun, shields caught the light in fleeting flashes, and the sound of measured footsteps carried across the field, merging with the distant hum of anticipation. Every soldier moved with awareness that the fate of Troy, and perhaps of their own lives, rested upon actions measured in courage and guile. Hector stood at the forefront, his armor heavy but his resolve unyielding. Each glance toward the Greek ranks carried the weight of command and the burden of love for a city whose walls he had sworn to protect. He read the motions of the enemy as one reads the delicate lines of a poem, with careful attention, noting subtle shifts, anticipating strikes, and calculating risks with a mind both sharp and weary. Every decision, every gesture, was amplified by the knowledge that even the smallest misstep could herald ruin. Within the gates, the people of Troy moved silently. Mothers clutched children, elders watched with quiet dread, and the city itself seemed to sigh under the weight of collective fear. Andromache, standing among the women gathered in prayer, felt the tension coiled tightly within her chest. The quiet of the morning was deceptive, a thin veneer over the turbulence of fate that simmered just beyond sight. Her hands, folded over her child, trembled slightly as she imagined Hector leading his men, confronting inevitability with courage alone. Priam, observing from the highest balcony, traced the horizon with steady eyes. The golden towers of the city caught the sun in fragments, reflecting light that seemed both fragile and resolute. His thoughts lingered on his sons, on the soldiers who would not return, and on the ephemeral nature of glory and life. Every breath he drew was a meditation on mortality, every heartbeat a drum of sorrow and love entwined. He understood, with the clarity granted only by age and grief, that Troy's endurance was measured not merely by walls and arms, but by the courage of those who lived within them. As the day advanced, tension settled over the battlefield like a tangible presence. The Greek commanders exchanged glances, their faces masks of calculation, yet their eyes revealed the weight of exhaustion and awareness of inevitability. Even as they prepared to press forward, the undercurrent of prophecy whispered through their ranks that Troy's fall would not arrive through brute force alone, but through the cunning of minds sharpened against the sharp edge of destiny. And so the day stretched forward, measured in careful motions, whispered strategies, and the quiet reverberation of grief across both camps. Heroes moved, city walls stood, and the pulse of fate beat steadily beneath all. The stage was set for the inevitable tragedies that would shape the memory of Troy for generations, and in the hush of mid-morning, the city held its breath once more, poised between heroism and ruin. The echoes of sorrow from the plains and the gates lingered still over Troy, a city suspended between grief and the fragile hope of survival. The air hung heavy with smoke and the subtle scent of ash, remnants of battles past, yet the city appeared outwardly calm, as if the stones themselves had learned to feign peace. Streets, usually teeming with life and movement, were quiet beneath the golden towers. Shadows stretched long and silent across the cobbled lanes, and the faint glow of torches lent a dreamlike shimmer to doorways and arches. The inhabitants, weary and wary, moved cautiously, their voices hushed, their steps tempered by the unspoken understanding that Troy teetered upon a precipice of fate. Within the Greek camp, Odysseus moved like a shadow himself, a mind sharpened by both cunning and exhaustion. His gaze lingered on the walls of Troy, noting the movements of guards, the rotation of sentinels, and the faint flicker of lights in windows. He traced invisible lines between towers and gates, seeing in his mind the orchestration of what was to come. Every glance, every motion, every silent calculation was a step along a path woven in shadows, a plan as delicate as it was dangerous. The wooden horse, carved with deceptive grandeur, stood at the center of the encampment, its polished surfaces gleaming faintly in the pale moonlight. Within its hollow heart lay the instruments of the city's undoing, the finest warriors hidden beneath layers of artifice and quiet, a secret waiting for the hour of revelation. In Troy, the first hints of unease began to ripple through the streets. Though the day had passed without fresh assault, the city's defenders felt the lingering tremor of tension that followed prolonged strife. Soldiers rested in small groups, leaning against walls, tending their armor, yet their eyes never strayed far from the horizon. Parents whispered to children who played lightly in courtyards, their laughter bright yet fragile, threading a tenuous illusion of normalcy through the city's anxious rhythm. The contrast between innocence and the encroaching shadow of doom was stark. The fragility of peace emphasized in every delicate motion and hushed word. Andromache moved among the households, offering comfort where it could be given, tracing her hands along the stones of doorways and windows, feeling for a sense of permanence that no longer fully existed. She lingered in the chambers of the palace, pausing before Hector's shield and armor, still gleaming faintly from the day's sun, imagining the weight of his presence even in his absence. Her breath caught as she pictured the streets outside, children chasing one another in bright defiance of worry, soldiers stretching and flexing in the shallow light of evening, and the vast, patient calm of the night sky above. The city seemed poised, as if holding its breath, unaware that the threads of fate had already begun to weave the final chapter of its story. Odysseus' plan, like a tide creeping beneath the surface, moved silently toward fruition. The horse, more than wood and craftsmanship, was a vessel of inevitability. Its carved form whispered of gift and honor, yet beneath its hollow heart lay the end of the city. Every detail, from its proportions to its grand facade, was calculated to appeal to the weary hearts and overburdened minds of Troy's defenders. Victory appeared within reach without struggle, a monument of generosity disguised as doom. And as the night deepened, the first whispers of doubt drifted through the palace corridors, subtle as wind, yet impossible to ignore once heard. The stars above reflected faintly upon the city walls, glimmering like distant witnesses to the human drama below. Each light seemed to watch silently, indifferent yet eternal, as Troy slumbered, unaware of the quiet treachery advancing toward its gates. The city's pulse slowed in the calm of the evening, measured in small, careful movements, yet beneath the surface, the currents of destiny shifted with the precision of a master's hand. The dance of fate was already underway, its rhythm almost imperceptible, yet unyielding in its certainty. As the moon climbed higher, casting elongated shadows across courtyards and battlements, the wooden horse waited at the edge of the camp, still and patient, a sentinel of illusion. Its form, monumental and silent, reflected both the artistry of Greek cunning and the inevitability of human trust. Every plank, every carved curve seemed alive with hidden purpose, and yet in its presence there was a haunting serenity, a deceptive calm that belied the chaos contained within. The city, poised between vigilance and exhaustion, could not yet see the shadow that would enter through its gates. The night deepened, and Troy remained enveloped in a fragile calm, its golden towers glowing faintly beneath the silver gaze of the moon. Citizens moved quietly along the streets, their steps careful, their whispers soft as if the very stones might overhear. In courtyards, children played in fleeting bursts of laughter, their innocence a fragile counterpoint to the tension that hummed unseen in the city's air. Soldiers patrolled the walls with measured precision, their eyes scanning the shadows, their hands brushing the hilts of weapons, alert yet weary from endless days of vigilance. Each breath drawn, each footfall, was a delicate negotiation with fate. Hector lingered upon the ramparts, watching the Greek camp from a distance. The wooden horse, now clearly visible in the dim glow of torchlight, stood like a monument to both hope and deception. Its vast form seemed almost reverent in its stillness, and yet Hector sensed something amiss, a subtle irregularity in its posture and the pattern of its shadows. A whisper of unease stirred in his mind, but he could not articulate it, nor did he know whether the city would heed the silent caution. Every instinct urged him to remain vigilant, to question the gift. Yet human desire for respite from war and suffering weighed heavily against prudence. Within the palace, Andromache moved silently, tending to the city's youngest and most vulnerable. She paused at each doorway, each window, her hands brushing the frames as though seeking reassurance from the stone itself. Her heart carried the memory of Hector, of battles fought and lives risked, and her mind teetered between hope and foreboding. The quiet of the night was deceptive, the stillness not an ally but a prelude. Every corner, every flicker of light, seemed imbued with the silent patience of fate, waiting for the moment when deception would step fully into the open. Priam, seated in the dimly lit hall of the palace, traced his fingers over the carved armrests of his throne, worn smooth by years of contemplation and grief. His gaze lifted to the walls and towers of Troy, noting the faint glimmer of torchlight on stone and the subtle movements of sentinels below. He spoke softly to the gods, to the winds, to any presence that might listen, though the silence returned to him unbroken. In the hush, he sensed that the city's fate was moving on a current invisible to mortal eyes, guided by minds both brilliant and merciless. The wooden horse, a gift wrapped in trust, had entered the city's periphery, a shadow waiting to consume all it embraced. Outside, the Greek camp maintained its disciplined quiet, yet a restless energy pulsed beneath the surface. Warriors hidden within the horse shifted ever so slightly, testing the confines of their prison, preparing for the moment when the city's gates would open to admit both illusion and doom. Odysseus observed from the camp, his mind tracing every possibility, every subtle movement of Troy's defenders. Each heartbeat, each careful breath, was aligned with the delicate timing of his design, the orchestration of deceit perfected over nights of patient calculation. As the moon rose higher, spilling silver across the city's battlements and the quiet streets below, the tension became almost tangible. Troy seemed suspended between two realities, one of fragile peace and domesticity, the other of impending betrayal and collapse. The air carried the scent of salt and smoke, of burning torches and the distant memory of battle, mixing with the quieter fragrances of night-blooming flowers and warm stone. It was a night pregnant with expectation, each second measured, each shadow laden with possibility. In the silent heart of the city, few could sense the peril that had already reached their gates. The horse, monumental and silent, waited in the encampment's edge, its wooden body a vessel of hidden fury and cunning. In the quiet, it seemed almost reverent, yet the stillness was deceptive, a calm that promised nothing and concealed everything. Soon the city would stir, and with its stirring, the threads of fate would unravel. As the hours waned toward midnight, a hush fell over Troy deeper than any seen in months. Windows glimmered faintly with lamp light, casting long, wavering shadows upon the streets. The city seemed to exhale softly, holding its breath against the unspoken knowledge that lingered in the air, intangible yet insistent. Soldiers leaned against battlements, arms folded across chests, their eyes tracing the faint outlines of the Greek camp. The stillness of night amplified every sound. The whisper of wind through leaves, the soft shuffle of a guard's boot, the distant splash of water against the quay. Hector, patrolling along the inner walls, sensed the weight of inevitability pressing upon the city. His mind traced patterns and possibilities, every contingency considered, every guard placement calculated. And yet he felt the peculiar charm of the wooden horse, standing monumental at the edge of the encampment. Its grandeur seemed almost sacred, its polished form gleaming faintly in torchlight. The gifts of Greek warriors were often generous, but Hector could not ignore a shadow of doubt, a subtle disturbance in the harmony of the night. The pull of caution warred with the city's weariness and desire for reprieve, a quiet battle of minds unseen by anyone but him. Inside the palace, Andromache moved through the quiet halls, her presence a soft rhythm in the city's fragile heart. She paused before the chambers that had once been Hector's, lingering over the traces of his presence, a sword polished and resting, a shield leaning against the wall, the faint scent of leather and smoke still lingering. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes traced the contours of the room, aware of the calm outside, yet sensing the undercurrent of danger. Each breath, each motion, seemed synchronized with the slow pulse of the city, and yet the shadow of the unseen threatened to tip the balance. Priam, seated high upon the balcony, gazed toward the encampment with careful scrutiny. He saw the horse, monumental and still, and the figures surrounding it, each a silent part of the greater design. His age and sorrow had taught him to see beyond appearances, to trace the currents of human intent hidden beneath gestures and words. He muttered prayers into the cold night air, hoping that some unseen force would grant clarity. Yet he knew in his heart that the city's fate rested upon vigilance that may already have been too late. From within the horse, the Greek warriors shifted quietly, their movements small but deliberate. Odysseus had taught them patience, the art of stillness, and the necessity of timing. They knew that Troy's fate was suspended upon the delicate balance of trust and perception. Each breath taken within the hollow wooden walls was measured, each thought turned inward, as they waited for the city to lower its guard and welcome them within. Outside, the sentinels maintained their watch, oblivious to the storm concealed in wood and shadow. The night stretched onward, quiet and unyielding. Even the air seemed to hold a breathless expectancy, the gentle sway of leaves and the distant crash of waves against the shore echoing like a lullaby of tension. Troy itself seemed to slumber, yet beneath the stones, within the walls and hearts of men and women, the threads of destiny coiled tighter, waiting for the signal that would unravel the city's fortune. The calm before catastrophe was a living thing, a slow, deliberate rhythm that traced every shadow and every heartbeat. And as the moon reached its zenith, casting its silver glow upon the silent city, the monumental horse seemed to breathe with anticipation, a silent sentinel poised to deliver the end, cloaked in the guise of generosity. Troy, in all its golden beauty and fragile hope, remained unaware that the first step of doom had already crossed the threshold of perception, and that the song of its glory would soon be reduced to whispers in the wind. The city of Troy stirred faintly as midnight waned, the hush of evening giving way to a more deliberate stillness. Windows caught the faint glimmer of the moon, reflecting it back in fractured patterns across courtyards and walls. In the streets, guards shifted positions with the silent precision that comes from long nights of vigilance. Yet beneath this rhythm of watchfulness, an almost imperceptible tension threaded through every stone and every shadow, whispering of inevitability. Troy was alive, yet it moved as though in a dream, unseeing of the danger that had already crept to its gates. Odysseus lingered at the edge of the Greek camp, eyes sharp beneath the silver glow. He observed the city, noting the rotation of sentinels, the flicker of lamps within homes, and the subtle movements of Troy's defenders. Every detail mattered, every sigh of the wind or ripple of the sea a messenger. The wooden horse stood monumental, polished, and serene, its hollow belly containing the instruments of fate. Inside, Greek warriors held their breath, bodies coiled like springs, waiting for the city to embrace them as if they were a gift rather than a vessel of doom. The quiet was theirs to wield, the night a canvas upon which deception could be painted without interruption. Within the palace, Andromache's hands rested upon the cool stone of the walls, tracing their contours as if to anchor herself to the reality of Troy's survival. She moved through the hallways softly, checking on children, adjusting torches, ensuring that the city's pulse remained steady. Her mind drifted to Hector, imagining him patrolling the ramparts, his gaze tracing the horizon as it had so many nights before. Each heartbeat, each measured step of the guards outside, resonated with the unspoken rhythm of the city, delicate, careful, and unaware that the first threads of betrayal were already woven into the fabric of Troy's night. Priam watched from the highest balcony, his hands resting upon the railing, knuckles pale in the moonlight. His eyes followed the contours of the encampment and the monumental horse, noting the absence of movement from its surface, the eerie serenity that disguised the violence concealed within. His age had taught him patience and discernment, yet even his wisdom struggled against the subtlety of Odysseus' design. Every instinct whispered caution, yet he could not divine the full measure of the coming night. The city, radiant and unaware, slept beneath the weight of its golden towers, trusting in walls and vigilance, and yet the shadow of cunning waited just beyond their reach. In the streets, the soldiers' murmurs were low, measured, a lullaby of readiness and fatigue. Their weapons rested by their sides, their eyes reflecting both exhaustion and determination. They scanned the horizon as they had countless times before, unaware that the greatest peril would arrive not with the clash of spears, but with the quiet, deliberate step of human trust misplaced. Each heartbeat in the city seemed amplified in the stillness, a soft drum marking the approach of what was already inevitable. The wooden horse loomed larger in the moonlight, casting long shadows across the sand and stones, a silent sentinel of fate. Within its hollow form, Greek warriors breathed shallowly, muscles tensed, minds sharpened by anticipation. Time seemed to stretch, each second drawn taut, as if the night itself conspired to heighten the tension before the release. The city slept, and in that sleep lay its vulnerability. Soon the gates would open, and the gift of wood would transform into the instrument of final ruin. And as the moon dipped lower toward the horizon, the night held its quiet breath, waiting for the moment when calm would shatter and Troy's story would move from whispers to flames. The city remained unaware, poised between hope and disaster as the threads of destiny coiled ever tighter, ready to unravel with the first echo of betrayal. The hour had grown late, and a silver haze settled over the city, softening the edges of walls, towers, and streets. Even the harbor waters reflected the moon with a ghostly patience, as if they too awaited the unfolding of events. Within Troy, life persisted in fragile rhythms. Sentinels paced the walls, lanterns flickered faintly in the palace corridors, and the occasional footstep on cobblestone echoed like a whisper through the night. Yet the calm was deceptive. A thin veneer stretched across the weight of countless omens and warnings that had gone unheeded. Hector, vigilant as ever, traced the perimeter of the ramparts. His eyes lingered on the horizon, then returned to the wooden horse, monumental and serene at the edge of the Greek encampment. Something about its stillness gnawed at him, an intuition born of experience and instinct. He scanned the city's gates, questioning whether the soldiers entrusted with vigilance would notice subtle anomalies. Yet weariness tugged at even the most steadfast hearts, and the desire to believe in respite from battle-clouded judgment. Each step Hector took was careful, deliberate, yet the shadow of doubt could not be fully acted upon without seeming paranoia. Inside the palace, Andromache's vigil continued. She moved silently among chambers, checking on children and servants alike, whispering gentle reassurances, tracing her fingers over door frames, walls, and the smooth stone of the hall. Her mind replayed Hector's campaigns, the lives lost, and the fragile beauty of fleeting peace. She imagined the streets outside, the quiet laughter of children, the faint glimmer of torchlight in windows. A subtle tension settled in her chest, a premonition she could not name. The night held a quiet, deliberate patience, and she felt its weight pressing upon every heartbeat. Priam's gaze remained fixed on the encampment. The horse's silhouette was now fully bathed in moonlight, every plank and curve defined in stark relief against the darkened sands. Within its hollow, warriors lay in motionless anticipation, instruments of doom waiting for the moment of their release. Priam whispered prayers into the night, not for strength, nor for victory, but for clarity, for the wisdom to discern the hidden currents beneath the calm surface of the Greek gift. Yet the silence of the heavens offered no answer, only a soft echo of inevitability that traveled across stone and air alike. The city itself seemed to participate in the illusion, streets quiet, doors closed, families huddled together. Soldiers adjusted armor and weaponry, scanning the horizon in measured vigilance, yet unaware that the most dangerous threat required no clashing of arms. The wooden horse, a gift of deceptive grandeur, carried within it the seeds of final destruction. Its stillness mocked the city's sense of safety, and the monumental patience of its form mirrored the inexorability of fate. As midnight deepened, the first movements toward action began to stir in the Greek camp. Warriors hidden within the horse shifted carefully, bodies coiled, minds sharpened. Odysseus' plan, executed with silent precision, had reached the threshold of its critical moment. Every detail, from the placement of the horse to the rotation of sentinels in Troy, aligned with the timing of the deception. Troy remained unaware, its golden towers gleaming faintly under the moon, as if offering their brilliance as tribute to a peace that was no more. And so the night stretched onward, suspended in the tension of anticipation, the quiet before irrevocable change. Troy's streets held their breath, its inhabitants dreamed and whispered, unknowing that the instrument of doom stood at their gates, patient, silent, and eternal in its quiet threat. Each heartbeat, each step, each shadow traced the slow rhythm of inevitability that would, with the coming hours, transform the city's story into legend. The city of Troy slept lightly under the silver gaze of a moon that climbed higher, spilling cold light across battlements, courtyards, and streets. The golden towers shimmered faintly, as if aware of the weight of history resting upon them. Yet this shimmer was fragile, a delicate veil draped over the city's vulnerability. Windows glowed with the soft luminescence of household lamps, the low murmur of whispered prayers, and the occasional sigh of weary guardians threading through the night. Life persisted in careful rhythm, each breath and movement measured, yet every sound seemed amplified in the hush, echoing the invisible tension that lay coiled in shadows. Hector, vigilant even in the hour when most rested, moved along the walls with quiet purpose. His eyes traced the horizon, noting the faint glimmer of the Greek encampment and the monumental wooden horse, still and silent at the edge of the sands. His instincts, honed by countless battles and the wisdom of years, whispered caution. The horse's stillness, its deceptive grandeur, suggested patience and benevolence, yet Hector sensed the presence of concealed danger. He considered ordering further reconnaissance, yet the night's subtle gravity pressed upon him. The city's weariness had dulled even the sharpest of senses. Within the palace, Andromache walked softly through the halls, her fingers tracing the cold stones, her mind shadowed with premonitions she could not fully name. Her eyes lingered on the children sleeping in their rooms, on the small artifacts of home and hearth, and on the empty spaces where Hector's presence once anchored their days. She whispered quiet prayers into the night air, tracing the rhythms of the city's heartbeat as though seeking to synchronize it with her own. The stillness outside was deceptive, a quiet that promised safety even as danger waited patiently at the gates. Priam observed from the balcony high above the city, his eyes sweeping over streets and battlements alike. The horse's shadow stretched long across the sand, a monument to Greek cunning and the patience of men who had learned the art of war through intellect rather than brute force. He felt the weight of the night pressing against him, the sense that the city's fate rested upon slender threads woven of both vigilance and chance. He murmured prayers that drifted into the emptiness above, though the silence of the heavens returned only faint echoes, carrying no guidance, only the certainty of mortality. Within the hollow horse, the Greek warriors shifted ever so slightly, muscles coiled like springs, minds sharpened by the anticipation of imminent action. Odysseus' plan, executed with meticulous care, had reached the moment when the city's own complacency would allow it to proceed unchallenged. The hidden warriors were patient, every heartbeat and measured breath a preparation for the quiet chaos that would erupt once Troy embraced the gift. The wooden horse, monumental and still, was both silent sentinel and harbinger, the embodiment of a fate crafted with ingenuity and patience. The streets of Troy, quiet and seemingly safe, carried the echo of dreams and hope, oblivious to the inevitability approaching within the folds of night. The city slept, mothers whispered to children, guards leaned against walls, and the wind traced delicate patterns along cobblestone lanes. Yet beneath this semblance of peace, destiny coiled tightly, its threads ready to unravel the city's history with a subtle, unstoppable inevitability. As the moon began its slow descent toward the horizon, shadows lengthened and deepened across the gates, towers, and streets. Troy, radiant and fragile, remained unaware that the wooden horse at the camp's edge was no longer merely a gift, but a pivot of destiny. The night, heavy with expectation, carried a quiet promise of transformation, of ruin wrapped in beauty, of history poised to shift forever. As the golden walls of Troy fell beneath fire and fury, a silence descended heavier than any night the city had ever known. Smoke curled into the sky, twisting like pale fingers toward gods who watched without interference, their faces shadowed with the weight of inevitability and disdain. Streets that once echoed with children's laughter and the clamor of commerce now lay empty, broken only by the occasional crackle of burning timbers or the distant, mournful cry of a survivor. The city had surrendered not just its walls, but its heartbeat, leaving the remnants of life and memory scattered across stone and ash. Agamemnon's ships drifted upon the waters beyond the city, sails heavy with wind and the exhausted sighs of warriors who had conquered yet found no solace in victory. He stared toward the horizon, eyes tracing the faint glimmer of home that seemed to mock him with every wavering light. In his heart, triumph mingled uneasily with guilt and weariness, a weight that no victory could light. His companions moved about the deck, quiet shadows among shadows, each carrying invisible wounds and memories of the lives they had taken, the friends they had lost, and the city they had raised. The sea, vast and indifferent, swallowed all these burdens into its restless embrace, carrying whispers of Troy with each ebb and surge. Odysseus, aboard a separate vessel, felt the first stirrings of what would become an odyssey of endless wandering. The waters responded to the gods' displeasure, wind and current conspiring to scatter his fleet across the Mediterranean. Each night, the stars shifted in unfamiliar patterns, and the sea became a mirror reflecting not the sky, but the burden of memory. Waves lapped against the hull, murmuring the voices of fallen comrades and citizens alike. Every swell was a reminder that the war was not yet concluded, that the toll of destruction did not end with the fall of a city, but lingered, insistent, in the hearts of men and the rolling of the waves. Meanwhile, the ghosts of Troy, those who had perished in the fire, those whose bodies were claimed by flame or sword, seemed to drift invisibly across the sea. Their cries were woven into the wind, rising with the spray of salt and surf, a sorrowful cadence that haunted every wave. Even the survivors carried the imprint of loss. The mothers who had wept for sons, the warriors who had fought for honor, the kings who had watched their legacy crumble into ash. Each vessel, each sailor, each fragment of memory became a carrier of Troy's shadow, a testament to a city whose story would survive not in its stones, but in the souls of those it had touched. The gods, ever watchful, observed from their distant thrones. Some whispered to the winds, some tilted the currents, and others, in their silence, allowed fate to carry the mortals where it willed. Hubris and human desire had led them to victory, yet victory brought no comfort. The sea, vast and unrelenting, became the stage upon which recompense and wandering would play out. The wind that tore at sails and the waves that pressed against hulls were neither allies nor enemies. They were memory made manifest, a reminder that no conquest could erase the echo of what had been lost. As the moon rose high above this expanse of turbulent waters, it illuminated the ships scattered like pieces of a broken mosaic. Each vessel, adrift upon the dark expanse, carried warriors who were ghosts of their former selves, shadows of glory and grief intertwined. The air was thick with the scent of brine and smoke, the lingering taste of victory soured by the weight of loss. And in that hush, as the waves swelled and receded, the first whisper of legend began to stir, a quiet promise that even amid ruin, the story of Troy would endure. The morning broke pale and hesitant over the scattered Greek fleet, the sun gilding the restless waters with streaks of silver and gold. Yet there was no joy in its light, only the reflection of countless faces etched with weariness, grief, and the quiet weight of memory. Each ship moved like a shadow of its former self, carrying warriors who had seen the heights of glory and the depths of ruin, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that Troy's fall had not brought them peace. The sea whispered in ceaseless rhythm, the waves recalling the cries, the laughter, the love, and the terror of the city now reduced to smoke and ash. Agamemnon, seated upon the deck of his flagship, traced the undulating horizon with eyes that had long grown accustomed to sorrow. Victory had been seized by force, yet it brought him no satisfaction. He recalled the faces of fallen men, the groans of those crushed beneath the ramparts, and the echo of Hector's last gaze, noble even in the shadow of death. Every memory pressed upon him with the gravity of a stone, a weight that the wind could not lift, and the sea, indifferent and eternal, seemed to carry the ghosts of Troy along with the fleet, mingling the cries of mortals with the sighs of gods. Odysseus, observing the scattered currents from the prow of his own vessel, recognized the unfolding pattern of divine ire. Winds shifted without reason, currents twisted as if guided by unseen hands, and the stars above no longer provided guidance but reflected the disquiet of fate. Each wave seemed imbued with remembrance, each swell a subtle admonition. He understood, as all men must, that the end of war was not the end of its consequences. Memory, sorrow, and guilt were companions more relentless than any army, and the sea would not release them until it had extracted its full measure. On board, the Greek soldiers were silent, each lost in the quiet chambers of reflection. The clatter of oars had ceased. The creak of rigging was a soft, lonely refrain against the wind. Some stared into the void of water stretching to the horizon, seeing not the open sea but the ruins of Troy mirrored in its shifting surface. Others whispered prayers or muttered soft laments, not for themselves, but for those left behind, fathers, sons, brothers, and lovers whose lives had ended abruptly, their stories consumed in the flame of ambition. Each wave carried their sorrow, and each gust of wind seemed to echo a name lost to history. The ghosts of Troy did not rest. Beneath the surface, in shadowed coves and beneath gentle ripples, they drifted with the currents, tethered neither to ship nor shore, their forms as fleeting as mist. Some rose in memory, invisible to mortal eyes, their lamentations brushing against the ears of those alive, stirring hearts with inexplicable ache. Mothers who survived felt phantom touches upon their shoulders. Warriors felt sudden pangs of emptiness that recalled friends long gone. The sea, both vessel and cemetery, preserved these echoes, and the living could not escape the haunting cadence of what had been lost. As the day progressed, the wind strengthened, bending sails and tossing waters into restless shapes. Ships, once proud and orderly, now lurched like fragments upon a boundless tide. Men gripped rails and ropes with pale hands, eyes narrowed against salt spray and sky alight. Each captain wrestled with his vessel and with his conscience, for the sea carried the punishment of hubris and the reminder that mortal conquest rarely yields serenity. The fall of Troy had been total, Yet the shadow it cast stretched far across oceans, through storms and silence alike, carrying with it sorrow, memory, and the unrelenting cadence of fate. Night returned over the scattered Greek fleet, draping the sea in an obsidian calm that seemed heavier than the day's heat. Lanterns swayed upon the decks, casting soft, trembling pools of light onto weathered faces, each etched with lines of grief, exhaustion, and the lingering echo of Troy's fall. The stars above, once markers of guidance and hope, now seemed distant and indifferent, their cold brilliance reflecting the emptiness of victory. The waves whispered incessantly, curling against the hulls with soft murmurs that carried the voices of the dead, their lamentations threading through the wind like invisible cords. Agamemnon remained vigilant upon the deck, his eyes tracing the horizon with a gaze sharpened by weariness. Each distant glimmer of moonlight upon the waves seemed a phantom city, a memory of what had been lost. Even in triumph, the burden of command pressed upon him relentlessly. The faces of fallen allies and vanquished foes alike floated in his thoughts, mingling with the cries of survivors and the silent judgment of the gods. Victory had left him hollow. His soul felt the weight of countless lives extinguished in fire and blood. In every ripple of the sea, he sensed the echo of Troy's sorrow, as though the waters themselves carried the city's spirit across the waves. Odysseus, aboard another vessel, contemplated the vast expanse around him with a mind sharpened by cunning and foresight. The gods had not abandoned him, nor had they bestowed mercy. Their displeasure, subtle yet omnipresent, guided wind and tide, scattering his fleet and turning the waters into a labyrinth of uncertainty. Waves rose like restless spirits, foaming and curling against the hulls, reminding each man that the consequences of war extended far beyond the walls of Troy. Each gust of wind was a whisper of warning, each swell a pulse of remembrance, and every shadow upon the waves seemed to carry the weight of memory. On board, the Greek warriors endured the night in quiet contemplation. Their bodies were tense, coiled against fatigue, their hands gripping rails and ropes as though seeking to tether themselves to something solid in the midst of uncertainty. Some whispered soft prayers for the dead, for the lost, and for their own deliverance. Others sat in silence, staring into the dark expanse of water, haunted by visions of the city they had conquered and the lives consumed in its destruction. Each wave seemed to murmur the names of Troy's fallen, and the air was thick with the ghosts of memory, pressing invisibly upon shoulders and hearts alike. The sea itself seemed a living entity, absorbing sorrow, carrying whispers, and preserving the haunting echoes of Troy. Beneath the surface, currents tangled with fragments of history, lost weapons, drifting debris, and the faint presence of those who had perished. The wind carried these fragments across miles of water, weaving a tapestry of grief and remembrance that stretched beyond mortal comprehension. The living could not separate themselves from the past. Each breath, each motion, each heartbeat was tethered to the consequences of war and the persistence of memory. In the hush of night, a faint glow began to edge the horizon, the first hint of dawn stirring in the distance. It was a fragile light, soft and tentative, yet it carried the promise of legend. Though sorrow still weighed upon hearts and the sea held its restless song, the world had begun to shift. The stories of heroism, loss, cunning, and endurance etched in fire and blood were becoming immortal, destined to travel across seas and generations. And within this delicate prelude of mourning, the ghosts of Troy and the living alike drifted together in a mournful harmony, their shared memory a bridge between what was and what would endure. As dawn's first light stretched across the horizon, the sea shimmered with a quiet, spectral luminescence. Mist rose from the waves, curling and shifting as if reluctant to release the night's shadows. Each vessel of the Greek fleet cut through this haze like a ghostly memory, their sails trembling against the breath of wind that carried both the scent of salt and the lingering tang of fire from Troy. The warriors aboard moved with a lethargy born of both physical exhaustion and the weight of their conscience. Victory had been claimed, yet peace remained elusive, drifting just beyond reach like a reflection upon the restless waters. Agamemnon stood at the prow, his gaze fixed upon the morning sea. The sun, faint and hesitant, cast long, silver fingers across the undulating waves. In their movement, he imagined the streets of Troy once more, the golden towers, the bustling marketplaces, the laughter and cries that had filled every corner. Each memory pressed upon him with the weight of inevitability, a reminder that mortal triumph is fleeting and fragile. Even kings are bound by the currents of fate, swept along by forces beyond their understanding, unable to escape the toll exacted by both ambition and human folly. Odysseus, navigating another stretch of these same waters, sensed the restless power lingering in each wave. The gods, unseen yet omnipresent, had tempered the winds with subtle cruelty. Storms rose and fell without warning, guiding, testing, and scattering those who had dared to claim victory too easily. Each swell of water seemed to echo Troy's fall, the cries of the dead rising and falling in a rhythm that mingled with the rolling of the ship. The sea had become a mirror of consequence, reflecting not only the deeds of men, but the sorrow of a city erased, the anguish of families and warriors, and the weight of destiny itself. On board the ships, silence enveloped the men in a fragile shroud. Some clutched the remnants of memories, tokens of fallen comrades, fragments of personal devotion, scraps of letters carried in the folds of garments. Others stared outward, letting their thoughts drift with the waves, listening to the whisper of currents as if they spoke in the tongues of the lost. The quiet was thick and somber, but within it there existed a strange intimacy, a communion of grief shared by those who survived and those who lingered unseen beneath the waters. The ghosts of Troy did not rest. Their presence lingered in the mist, entwined with the currents and borne on the wind. Mothers who had wept for sons, warriors who had fallen beneath the walls, and citizens who had known both hope and terror drifted as echoes among the living. They did not haunt with vengeance, but with memory, a silent testament to the cost of ambition and the inevitability of mortality. Each wave seemed to carry a fragment of their story, a reminder that no conquest could erase the essence of a city, its people, and the lives interwoven with its fate. As the morning light strengthened, the scattered fleet began to regroup, each captain steering vessels with cautious purpose. Though the sea remained restless, the first glimmers of legend began to illuminate the horizon. Tales of heroism, cunning, sorrow, and endurance were forming in the minds of those who lived and would tell the story. Troy, though consumed by fire, had begun its journey into memory and myth, and upon the rising wind and restless waves, the song of the fallen city mingled with the cries and whispers of the living, a timeless resonance that would endure long after the ships had vanished from sight. The remnants of Troy, long swallowed by the earth and the passage of countless seasons, now lay quiet beneath a mantle of green. Grass and ivy crept over fallen stones, weaving themselves into the memory of a city whose walls had once reflected the sun like molten gold. Time moved like a gentle river over the ruins, carrying away smoke and flame, but never fully erasing the echoes of voices that had once filled the streets. Even as the wind brushed softly over empty gateways, it carried the whispers of those who had lived, loved, and perished there, their stories inscribed invisibly upon every fragment of stone and every sway of the trees. Poets and travelers came in later ages, drawn by the shadows of memory. Some traced the outlines of towers with careful fingers, others listened for the voices in the silence, hoping to catch a note of grief or joy long since past. The story of Troy, though buried in the soil, had taken root in the minds and hearts of humanity. Each telling, each verse, became a thread in a tapestry of remembrance, weaving a city of myth as vivid as the one once shattered by flame and steel. It was not merely a tale of war, but a mirror of human emotion, of love, envy, courage, and pride. Homer's voice, carried across centuries, crystallized these echoes into song. The clash of armies, the rage of heroes, and the tender sorrows of wives and mothers all found their place in verse. Even as centuries passed, the poetry preserved what stone and timber could not, the heartbeat of Troy itself, pulsing beneath the rhythm of each line. The bard's words gave immortality to fleeting glances, whispered fears, and the subtle, heartbreaking acts of valor that had been lost to time. Through their artistry, the city and its people endured, preserved in the tender attention of human memory. Yet memory itself is a fragile thing, easily altered by the passage of years. As Troy's physical presence faded beneath the encroaching wilderness, its legend expanded into something larger than reality. Each telling became a reflection, not only of what had been, but of the hopes, fears, and dreams of those who retold it. Priam's sorrow, Hector's courage, Helen's beauty, and Achilles' wrath, all were reborn again and again, reshaped by the hearts that carried them. In this way, Troy never truly vanished. It survived in the collective imagination, a city that exists simultaneously in the past and in the eternal present of human consciousness. Across distant lands, travelers and scholars, poets and dreamers encountered the name of Troy, each hearing the story refracted through time. The echoes of its fall became a lesson, a warning, a comfort, and a fascination. They spoke not only of kings and warriors, but of the fragile threads that connect humanity, loyalty, love, ambition, and pride. Even in the hush of centuries, these threads pulsed with quiet intensity, guiding the hearts of those who would listen and remember. And as the sun dipped beneath a horizon untouched by mortal conflict, the ruins of Troy seemed to exhale, as if acknowledging its own persistence. In the stillness of grass-grown streets and weathered stones, there was both melancholy and a gentle triumph, that though empires fall and walls crumble, the essence of a story, carefully held in human memory, remains eternal. Troy had been destroyed, yet it endured in whispers, in songs, and in the hearts of those who dream of love, pride, and destiny. Seasons turned with quiet inevitability, and the lands that had once been Troy transformed beneath the patient hand of time. Trees stretched their limbs over the broken stones, roots entwining with remnants of walls, carrying life into spaces once hollowed by fire and war. Birds nested in the crumbled gates, their songs layering over the silent memories of battle, creating a subtle chorus that seemed to bridge centuries. The city, though vanished in form, continued to breathe through the natural world, its presence woven into the cadence of wind, water, and stone. Each leaf that shimmered in the sun was a quiet testament to what had been, a soft echo of a once glorious city now reclaimed by the earth. Travelers ventured across these lands in later generations, guided by curiosity and by stories passed down like precious relics. Some came seeking the truth of the past, tracing the contours of vanished streets, imagining the footsteps of warriors and the measured pace of courtiers. Others came for inspiration, listening for the hidden pulse of memory beneath the grass and ivy. In the hush of early morning, the wind seemed to whisper fragments of voices. A mother's lament, a soldier's farewell, the laughter of children now long gone. These voices, suspended in the quiet, became the living soul of Troy, preserved not in walls, but in the attentive hearts of those who remembered. Poets and storytellers took up the city's song, shaping it into verse that traveled beyond the seas. Homer's epic, the Iliad, crystallized the grief, courage, and fleeting joys of a fallen world. His lines captured not only the fury of Achilles and the honor of Hector, but the tender human moments that otherwise would have been lost to time. The soft embrace of Andromache, the quiet prayers of Priam, the hesitant hope of men standing upon distant shore. Through rhythm and word, Troy lived anew, every repetition a renewal of its spirit. Each retelling imbued the city with immortality, turning tragedy into legend and memory into art. In distant lands, the echoes of Troy grew into a mirror for human experience. Kings and commoners alike recognized the truths embedded in the story, the consequences of pride, the cost of desire, and the fragility of mortal endeavor. Children heard the tale as a caution, lovers as a reflection of yearning, and warriors as a lesson in courage and restraint. The city became more than a place. It became an idea, a symbol of humanity's enduring struggles and enduring dreams. The fall of Troy was no longer merely historical. It was universal, a narrative flowing through the consciousness of all who listened and imagined. Even as centuries stretched onward, the ruins themselves seemed to pulse with memory. Stones, moss-covered and worn by wind and rain, held the faint imprint of footsteps, the shadow of walls, and the weight of countless lives. Travelers often reported a peculiar sense of presence, a soft, almost imperceptible hum in the air, as if the city's spirit lingered, neither fully gone nor fully manifest. Troy had become both history and legend, its essence preserved in the hearts of those who would carry its story forward, shaping the moral and emotional landscapes of generations yet unborn. And as night fell upon the quiet fields, stars mirrored the lights of forgotten towers, the heavens themselves reflecting the endurance of memory. In this serene moment, the past and the present intertwined, and the story of Troy rested not in stone, but in the soft, eternal pulse of human remembrance. Each heartbeat, each whisper of wind, each rustle of grass carried a fragment of its essence, ensuring that the echoes of heroism, love, and fate would continue to resonate far beyond the measure of years. The winds of history carried the tale of Troy across mountains, rivers, and seas, threading it into the fabric of distant civilizations. Merchants and travelers whispered fragments of the story in bustling marketplaces. Scholars recorded it on parchment beneath flickering candlelight, and minstrels sang of its heroes in the shadow of palace hall. Each retelling shifted subtly, colored by the teller's own heart, yet the core remained: Hector's bravery, Achilles' wrath, the beauty and peril of Helen, and the inexorable pull of destiny. Through these variations, Troy became more than a memory. It became a living narrative, resilient against the erasure of time, bridging the mortal and the mythic in ways that no stone or monument could. In quiet villages far from the plains of Asia Minor, parents spoke of Troy to their children, softening the horrors into lessons of courage and love. They whispered of kings who grieved, warriors who faltered, and the city that fell yet endured in memory. The story's cadence mirrored the rhythm of life itself, triumph intertwined with loss, joy with grief, and desire with restraint. Those who heard it carried fragments of Troy within them, subtle yet persistent, as though the city's heartbeat had found a permanent home in the human spirit. Meanwhile, poets sought to distill its essence into art that transcended language. Each verse, each carefully chosen word, captured both grandeur and intimacy. The clash of armies alongside the tremor of a mother's hand upon her child's shoulder, the roar of battle alongside a single whispered prayer to the gods. Through these meditations, Troy became universal, a mirror of human frailty and resilience. Listeners could see themselves in Hector's honor, in Achilles' fury, and in Helen's tragic beauty. In the hush of contemplation, the ruins and their stories intertwined, a bridge across centuries, reminding all who listened that the consequences of desire and pride are timeless. Even as empires rose and fell around the remnants of Troy, the story endured, carried in silence as well as song. Scholars, wandering philosophers, and wandering storytellers all felt the weight of the city's legacy. The idea that human striving, even when consumed by violence, leaves a trace beyond destruction. In their reflections, Troy was not only a cautionary tale, but also a repository of human complexity. Its laughter, grief, ambition, and love surviving long after the walls had crumbled. The city lived in thought, in memory, in the quiet space between what had been and what might be imagined. And as the sky deepened into twilight, the stars bore witness to this enduring resonance. Across forests, rivers, and oceans, the echoes of Troy whispered, soft and persistent, into the hearts of those willing to hear. Each breath, each quiet moment of reflection carried a piece of the city forward, ensuring that while empires may vanish and walls may fall, the story of Troy would remain eternal, a timeless reflection on love, pride, and destiny.